Hey guys, tonight we're crawling into a medieval castle bedroom, and I need you to understand something right away. You're not walking into a cozy stone cottage from a fairy tale. You're entering what is essentially a walk-in freezer built from several tons of limestone where your breath will frost in the air even though you're technically indoors. This isn't atmosphere. This isn't ambience. This is architectural hostility to human comfort, and you're about to spend the next 8 hours trying not to become a well-dressed corpse. Picture this. It's January 1340 something. You're a minor noble, not quite royalty, but comfortable enough to have your own chamber in a decent-sized castle. You've just finished a long day of managing estates, attending mass, and pretending to care about a visiting cousin's hunting stories. Now you're standing at the threshold of your bedroom, candle in hand, and the temperature drop as you cross that doorway is physically shocking. Outside your castle walls, it's perhaps 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside your bedroom, maybe 38. Maybe. The stone walls around you are 3 feet thick. During summer, this is wonderful. They keep interiors blessedly cool. But in winter, these same walls become thermal vampires. They've been absorbing cold for months, and now they radiate it inward with the steady commitment of a grudge. Touch one and your palm will recoil instantly. The stones don't just feel cold. They feel hungry. Your floor is stone too, possibly covered with rushes or a woven mat if you're fancy. But that's doing almost nothing. Cold rises from below like ground fog. Your ceiling, if you even have a proper ceiling and not just the underside of someone else's floor, offers zero insulation. Some castles have wooden ceilings, which helps marginally. Most don't. You're in a stone box. A very, very cold stone box. And here's the thing nobody tells you about medieval castle life: the grander the castle often, the colder your personal space. Bigger rooms meant more cubic feet of air to heat. Higher ceilings meant warmth escaped upward, and those impressive tall windows thermal disaster zones. The peasant in his timber-framed cottage with the central hearth was often warmer than you, the noble rattling around in your architectural status symbol. There's a reason medieval people were obsessed with bed curtains, tapestries, and layering. It wasn't aesthetic preference, it was survival architecture. Your bedroom isn't designed for comfort, it's designed to keep invaders out, and your family's lineage secure, temperature control. That's your problem. The castle has done its job by not collapsing on you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I want you invested in this journey, not just passing through. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Are you in Melbourne, at dawn, Minnesota, at midnight? I love knowing this little community spans the globe, all of us wondering how humans survived before central heating. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You set your candle on the small table near your bed. The flame barely pushes back the darkness. This isn't the warm, golden glow of movies. This is a grudging little light that makes shadows dance like they're mocking you. Tallow candles smell like rendered animal fat because that's exactly what they are. Beeswax, if you can afford it, smells better but costs a fortune. Either way, you're getting maybe 3 hours of light from one candle, and you're not wasteful enough to burn multiples just for the comfort of seeing your own room. You can hear the wind outside. It's not howling dramatically, this isn't a horror film, but it's persistent, testing every shutter, every gap in the stonework, every theoretical weakness in your wooden door. Medieval castles weren't airtight, they were sieves. Cold air infiltrated through gaps you couldn't even see, creating drafts that would snuff your candle if you weren't careful about placement. The hearth across the room still has embers from earlier glowing dully. You fed it before supper, but that was hours ago. The heat it produced has long since escaped through the chimney or been absorbed by the stone. Historians still argue whether bedroom fireplaces were common for anyone below the highest nobility before the 14th century, but let's assume you've got one. Doesn't matter. It's across the room and heat doesn't travel well through cold air. The space between the hearth and your bed might as well be the Arctic. This is your sleeping chamber. This stone tomb. This is where you're supposed to rest to feel safe to regenerate for tomorrow, and you're already shivering. The castle walls surrounding you right now are a masterpiece of military engineering and a catastrophe of thermal physics. They're thick enough to shrug off battering rams and siege engines, which is excellent if you're being attacked. But those same walls that make you invincible to enemies also make you vulnerable to something far more patient and persistent: winter itself. Let's talk about what stone actually does. Limestone, sandstone, granite, whatever your particular castle is built from these materials, have what's called high thermal mass. They absorb heat slowly and release it slowly. During a sunny summer day, the walls soak up warmth and radiate it back into your room all night, which is lovely. But during winter, the process reverses with cruel efficiency. The walls absorb cold from the exterior air, and then they radiate that cold inward toward you all night long. You can't win. Even if you manage to warm your chamber during the day, and that's a big if the walls are working against you, they've been cold for months. It would take sustained intense heat for weeks to actually warm the thermal mass of a 3-foot thick stone wall. You don't have that kind of fuel supply. Nobody does. So the walls stay cold, acting as giant heat sinks that suck warmth out of the air. There's a phenomenon that modern building scientists call a cold bridge. Basically, any structural element that transfers cold from outside to inside. Your entire castle is a cold bridge. The walls, the floors, the ceiling, stones, the support pillars, the window jambs, everything is conducting exterior cold directly into your living space. Medieval builders understood defense. They understood load-bearing arches and buttresses. They absolutely did not understand thermal breaks. Now add moisture to this equation. Stone is porous. During rain or snow, exterior walls absorb moisture which then migrates inward through the stone. When temperatures drop, that moisture can actually freeze inside the wall itself, creating ice crystals within the stone matrix. You might wake up and see frost patterns on your interior walls, not on the surface, but within the stone, visible through tiny cracks. It's beautiful in a nature is trying to kill me sort of way. The height of your chamber makes everything worse. Heat rises, which means any warmth generated at floor level immediately ascends toward the ceiling and vanishes. If your room has a high vaulted ceiling, and many castle chambers do because height equals status, you're essentially heating a vertical column of air that you're not even occupying. The warm air you need at bed level rushes upward like it's escaping a crime scene. Some castles experimented with wooden ceilings installed below the stone structure, creating a false ceiling that trapped a layer of dead air above. This helped marginally. But most chambers just accepted the reality your heat goes up cold, settles down, and you exist somewhere in the miserable middle. Windows deserve their own paragraph of complaint. Medieval castle windows evolved over centuries. Early Norman keeps had narrow arrow slits great for archers, terrible for light, but actually decent for heat retention because they limited surface area. By the 13th and 14th centuries, fashion demanded larger windows, especially in residential areas. More light, better views, higher status. Also catastrophic heat loss. Glass existed, but was fantastically expensive and not particularly effective. The panes were small, uneven, and set in lead or wooden frames that leaked air like a confession. Most windows were covered with wooden shutters, sometimes with oiled linen or parchment stretched across for translucency. Close the shutters, and you're in darkness but marginally warmer. Open them for light, and you might as well be sleeping outside. There's this persistent myth that medieval people just didn't notice cold the way we do, that they were somehow hardier. This is nonsense. Human physiology hasn't changed. A core body temperature dropping below 95 degrees causes hypothermia now, and it caused hypothermia then. Medieval people weren't more resistant to cold, they were just more experienced at managing it and more resigned to suffering it. The tower rooms were worst. If your chamber was in a tower, a common arrangement for defensive reasons, you were surrounded by exterior walls on all sides. No interior walls meant no borrowed heat from adjacent rooms. You were in a stone cylinder with cold coming at you from 360 degrees. Add the height factor, and tower rooms became legendary for their iciness. Historians still argue whether the nobility actually preferred these rooms or simply accepted them as the price of privacy and status. Personal chambers separated you from the communal hall, which was warmer but also crowded, noisy, and lacking in privacy. Your freezing tower room was at least yours. That meant something. The irony is sharp. The very features that made castles defensible, thick walls height, strategic positioning on hills or cliffs to catch wind, minimal openings made them nearly uninhabitable during winter. You were safe from human enemies while slowly being besieged by temperature itself. So here you stand in your stone box watching your breath condense in the candlelight. The walls around you are doing exactly what they were designed to do, being impenetrable barriers. Unfortunately, they're just as impenetrable to warmth, trying to stay in as they are to arrows trying to get in. Your bedroom is essentially a very fancy cave, and you're about to try to sleep in it. Look at the bed in front of you. Really look at it. This isn't a piece of furniture, this is a survival station, a microarchitecture of warmth, a wooden fortress specifically engineered to create a habitable pocket inside an uninhabitable room. Everything about its design is intentional, and none of it is about comfort in the way you understand that word. It's about not dying. The frame itself is massive. We're talking heavy oak posts, sometimes 6 inches thick, rising from the floor to support a wooden canopy overhead. This isn't delicate. This isn't something you assemble with an Allen wrench. This bed was built by carpenters possibly on site, and it's not moving unless you dismantle it completely. The weight alone, before you add the mattress, the curtains, the bedding, can easily exceed several £100s. Why so substantial? Because this frame has to support not just a sleeping platform but an entire enclosure system. The 4 posts at each corner rise 7, sometimes 8 feet high, connected at the top by horizontal beams that form a rectangular frame. From this upper framework you'll hang curtains on all 4 sides. The bed becomes a room within your room, a fabric-walled chamber that you can seal yourself inside. The canopy overhead isn't decorative. It's a ceiling, a false ceiling that stops your body heat from rising uselessly into the vast cold space above. Without it, warmth radiates upward and vanishes. With it, heat accumulates in the enclosed space around your body. The difference between having a canopy and not having one could be 10 degrees Fahrenheit in the microclimate where you're actually sleeping. The sleeping platform sits high off the ground, sometimes 3 feet up. This isn't about grandeur though, it certainly looks impressive. It's about cold air stratification. Remember, cold air is denser and settles at floor level. The bottom 2 feet of your chamber might be several degrees colder than the air at waist height. By elevating the sleeping surface, you're literally rising above the coldest layer of air in the room. Those of you who've slept in bunk beds know top bunk is always warmer. Same principle, medieval application. Access is via a wooden step or small ladder, sometimes a stool. You don't casually flop onto this bed. You climb into it with intention like boarding a ship. And once you're in, pulling those curtains closed around you, you're genuinely entering a different environmental zone. The mattress support is usually a lattice of rope stretched across the frame, hence the old phrase, sleep tight, which originally meant tightening those ropes when they sagged. Over time, rope lattices stretch and need adjustment, or they create a hammock-like sag that's murder on your back. Some wealthier households used wooden slats instead, which were more stable, but also more expensive and less flexible. Now here's where it gets interesting from a physics standpoint. The bed curtains aren't just hanging fabric, they're a technology. When drawn closed, they create an enclosed air pocket around the sleeping platform. Your body heat, instead of dissipating into the room, stays trapped in this fabric envelope. The curtains themselves, thick wool, heavy linen, sometimes layered, act as insulation. They stop drafts. They create a boundary between the frozen world of your stone chamber and the marginally less frozen world of your immediate sleeping space. Think of it like a tent inside a cave. The cave protects you from rain and wildlife. The tent protects you from the cave's microclimate. Your bed is the tent. The posts often had hooks or pegs for hanging clothes, keeping them off the cold floor, and bonus adding another layer of insulation when garments were draped along the interior curtain rod. Waste nothing. Every piece of fabric is a potential thermal barrier. Some beds featured wooden panels at the head and foot solid boards rather than just curtains. This created even better heat retention, essentially making the bed a wooden box with fabric sides. The headboard protected you from the wall behind which, remember, is radiating cold like a malevolent entity. Putting your head directly against a stone wall in winter could give you ear infections, headaches, or worse. The wooden headboard creates a buffer zone of dead air between you and the stone. Historians still argue whether bed design became more elaborate because of status competition or thermal necessity, probably both. A grand bed announced your wealth and lineage, but it also kept you alive through January. Form and function married out of necessity. Here's a detail that sounds absurd until you think about it. Bed curtains were sometimes lined with contrasting fabric, creating a double layer with an air gap between. That air gap, even if just an inch, dramatically improved insulation. Medieval people didn't understand thermodynamics in modern terms, but they absolutely understood through experience that trapped air equals warmth. The bed you're looking at right now probably cost more than a peasant family would earn in several years. The wood, the carpentry, the fabric, the ropes, the metal hardware, this represents significant investment. But it's not optional. Without this engineered sleeping environment, you genuinely might not survive winter in this stone room. You approach it now candle still in hand and pull back the heavy curtain at the side. The interior is dark like a cave mouth. The smell hits you wool linen, your own scent from previous nights, Maybe a hint of herbs if you've tucked lavender or rosemary into the bedding to discourage fleas. It's not unpleasant exactly. It smells inhabited. This is your fortress, your thermal refuge, your nightly salvation. And you're about to seal yourself inside it for the next 8 hours, trusting medieval engineering to keep your core temperature above the threshold of hypothermia. So far it's worked every other night. Probably it'll work tonight too. Probably. You reach for the curtain fabric and immediately feel its weight. This isn't decorative drapery, this is textile infrastructure, and it's heavy enough that pulling it requires actual effort. The fabric itself tells a story of thermal engineering that took centuries to refine. The outer layer is often wool, sometimes a heavy linen-wool blend dyed in rich colours if you can afford it, deep reds, forest greens, blues that cost a fortune because they're made from woad, or if you're extravagantly wealthy, indigo. But the colour isn't the point. The density is. This fabric is woven tightly enough to block drafts. Hold it up to candlelight and you'll see almost no light penetrating through. That's intentional. Air can't pass through easily either. Wool has a secret weapon even when it absorbs moisture, and it will from your breath, from the general dampness of winter air, it retains its insulating properties. Linen doesn't. Cotton, which is rare and expensive in medieval Europe, doesn't. But wool can be slightly damp and still trap air in its fibres, still create warmth. This is why shepherds don't freeze in the rain. This is why your bed curtains are wool. The curtains hang from rings or hooks along a rod that runs the perimeter of the canopy frame. When drawn, they overlap slightly at the corners and wherever they meet, creating a seal. Not a perfect seal, this isn't airtight, but enough to drastically reduce air exchange between the interior sleeping space and the hostile environment of your chamber. Inside, there's often a second layer of lighter fabric linen, usually creating that crucial air gap we talked about. This inner curtain might be lighter in colour, even white, which helps reflect the minimal candlelight back into the sleeping space. It also means you have options in the absolute depths of winter, both layers closed. In milder weather, just the inner curtain. In summer, you might tie them all back completely, though you'd probably still keep them down to create privacy and keep insects out. The bottom edges of the curtains often brush the floor or the mattress edge, minimising the gap where cold air can infiltrate from below. Some households weighted the curtain hems with small sewn-in stones or metal pieces to ensure they hung straight and sealed properly. Every detail matters when you're fighting thermodynamics with fabric and willpower. Now here's what happens when you close yourself inside. Within minutes, literally minutes, the temperature inside the curtained enclosure begins to rise. Your body generates heat constantly, about 100 watts, when you're at rest, roughly equivalent to an incandescent light bulb. In an open room, that heat dissipates immediately into the vast cold air volume. But inside your curtained bed, that heat accumulates. The fabric slows heat transfer to the outside environment. The canopy above stops thermal rise. The curtains around you block drafts. You're essentially inside a primitive sleeping bag, one that you've built around a wooden platform using textile physics. Within 15 or 20 minutes of lying still, the temperature inside your bed enclosure can be 10 to 15 degrees warmer than the ambient room temperature. That's the difference between miserable and tolerable. That's the difference between shivering all night and actually achieving sleep. Those curtains aren't saving your life in a dramatic sense, but they're absolutely preventing the slow-motion disaster of hypothermia-induced sleep disruption. There's a psychological component too. Drawing those curtains creates a boundary between you and the world, the stone walls, the darkness, the wind outside, the vast indifference of your cold chamber. All of it gets shut out. You're in a defined space now, a controllable space, roughly 6 feet by 6 feet, maybe 7 feet high. It's comprehensible. It's yours. Medieval people spent a huge portion of their lives in communal spaces, the Great Hall, the chapel, the courtyard. Privacy was rare and often associated with illness or death, but your bed curtains drawn was genuinely private. No one could see in, sound was muffled, you could whisper prayers, cry without being heard, have conversations with a bed partner that no one else could overhear. The curtains created not just thermal sanctuary, but social sanctuary. Servants, of course, had to open those curtains in the morning, which meant they potentially saw you in whatever state you woke in. This created elaborate protocols about knocking, announcing oneself, waiting for permission. The bed curtains demanded respect because they represented one of the only boundaries between a noble's body and the relentless publicity of medieval life. There were rules about curtain maintenance too. They had to be brushed regularly to remove dust, checked for moth damage, especially the wool layers. Sometimes taken down in summer and beaten outside to shake out accumulated debris. This wasn't trivial housekeeping. Damaged curtains meant compromised insulation, which could mean illness or death in the following winter. Historians still argue whether the elaborate embroidery and decoration on some surviving bed curtains was purely about status display or whether the additional thickness from embroidered thread actually improved insulation. Probably both. Why not be warm and impressive? You're standing now with the curtain pulled aside looking into the dark interior of your bed. The mattress is barely visible in the candlelight. The space feels smaller than the actual dimensions that's the fabric walls closing in the psychological compression of entering an enclosed space. You can smell the wool slightly lanolin-scented, mixed with whatever herbs were tucked into the mattress months ago. There's a mustiness that isn't quite unpleasant, just the smell of enclosed fabric and human habitation. One more deep breath of the room's freezing air. Then you'll climb up, slide between those curtains and let them fall closed behind you. The world outside will still be there. The stone walls, the winter, the wind, but it'll be on the other side of several pounds of wool. And that makes all the difference. Now let's talk about what you're actually going to lie down on, because calling it a mattress makes it sound far more uniform and civilized than the reality. What's on that sleeping platform is essentially a layered ecosystem of organic materials, each chosen for specific thermal and structural properties, assembled in a sequence that represents centuries of trial and error. The foundation layer resting directly on those rope lattices or wooden slats is usually a thick canvas or linen sack stuffed with straw, not hay straw. There's a difference. Straw is the hollow stalk left after grain is harvested. It's essentially tubes of air, which makes it an excellent insulator. Hay is dried grass, which compresses too much and rots faster when it inevitably absorbs moisture from your body. Straw maintains its structure better and critically stays drier. This straw mattress, sometimes called a palliasse, is thick, maybe 8 to 10 inches when fresh, though it compresses over time. It's also scratchy, uneven, and makes a distinct rustling sound every time you move. That crunching, whispering sound is part of the medieval sleeping soundscape. You never move silently on a straw mattress. Every adjustment announces itself. The straw needs replacing seasonally, ideally twice a year, but more realistically once annually, usually after harvest, when fresh straw is plentiful. Old straw becomes compacted, loses its insulating air pockets, and starts to smell. It also becomes a haven for insects, fleas, lice, bedbugs, all the greatest hits of medieval parasitology. Shaking out and restuffing the straw palliasse was a major household task, and nobody enjoyed it. On top of the straw layer, if you're reasonably prosperous, you have a second mattress, this one stuffed with wool, horsehair, or ideally feathers. This is where economic stratification becomes obvious. Feather mattresses are extraordinarily expensive because you need feathers from dozens, sometimes hundreds of birds. Goose down is the premium option, like compressible, excellent insulation. But goose down costs more than some servants earn in a year. Wool is more common for the middling nobility. It's still expensive but accessible, and it has that crucial property of retaining warmth even when damp. A wool-stuffed mattress over a straw base gives you both structure and insulation. The straw provides the firm foundation. The wool provides the thermal barrier between your body and the cold air below. Horsehair is interesting. It's incredibly durable, doesn't compress as much as wool, and has some natural springiness. Wealthy households sometimes mixed horsehair with wool to create a mattress that maintained its shape better over time. But horsehair has a distinct smell, especially when new, and it's coarser than wool. You'd never have horsehair directly against your skin. The mattress ticking the fabric containing all this stuffing was usually heavy linen, sometimes canvas stitched in channels or compartments to keep the filling from migrating to one end. Without compartmentalization, you'd end up with all the feathers or wool bunched at the foot of the bed by morning, which defeats the purpose. The stitching pattern mattered. Medieval mattress construction was a genuine craft. Between you and the mattress there are sheets. First, a bottom sheet of linen tucked under the mattress edges to create a smooth sleeping surface. Linen is crucial here because it wicks moisture away from your skin. You're going to sweat at night, not profusely, but enough that moisture management matters. Linen absorbs sweat and allows it to evaporate outward away from your body into the wool or feather layer below. This bottom sheet gets washed periodically, which is why linen is the choice. It can withstand boiling and beating without disintegrating. Medieval laundry was violent. Delicate fabrics didn't survive. Linen did. On top of you, there's a top sheet, also linen, which serves as a barrier between your body and the blankets piled above. This matters because while sheets get washed every few weeks or months, blankets almost never do. They're too heavy, too expensive, and washing them would destroy them. The top sheet protects the blankets from your body's oils and sweat, extending their lifespan considerably. Now here's a detail that sounds minor but isn't. The sheets are often scented with dried herbs, lavender, rosemary, thyme, either sprinkled between layers or sewn into small sachets tucked into the mattress. This isn't just about making things smell nice though, that's a bonus. Many medieval people believed these herbs discouraged insects and evil spirits. Historians still argue whether the herbs actually repelled fleas or whether this was pure folk belief. Either way, the psychological comfort of sleeping on something that smelled of lavender rather than old straw was real. The mattress assembly as a whole sits slightly higher at the head than the foot, a deliberate incline. This wasn't standard everywhere, but it was common enough to note. Sleeping with your head elevated was thought to aid digestion and prevent fluids from accumulating in your brain overnight. Medieval medicine had theories about humours and vapours rising or settling in the body depending on position. Some of it was nonsense, some surprisingly accurate. The incline also helped with breathing, particularly if you had any respiratory issues, which in smoky, drafty castle conditions you probably did. You sit on the edge of the mattress now and feel it compress beneath your weight. There's a definite give, but also structure. The straw underneath prevents you from sinking too far. The surface is uneven. You can feel the channels where the stuffing is distributed. There's a slight lumpiness that no amount of shaking and smoothing completely eliminates. Medieval people didn't expect mattresses to be perfectly flat and uniform. The concept of a standardized sleeping surface is modern. You slept on something organic, variable, and alive with the sounds of compressed plant matter and trapped air escaping as you settled in. This is what's going to support your body for the next 8 hours. It's not a Tempur-Pedic. It's not even a futon. It's a carefully constructed layer cake of agricultural byproducts and animal fibres engineered over centuries to provide the minimum necessary insulation between your vulnerable human body and the relentless cold radiating up from the stone floor 12 inches below. And honestly, it's going to work. Not perfectly, not comfortably by modern standards, but well enough that you'll survive until morning. Now comes the part where you pile things on top of yourself, until the weight becomes almost oppressive, because in medieval thermal logic, weight equals warmth. The blankets you're about to arrange over your body follow a specific layering strategy, each material chosen for properties that medieval people understood through experience even if they couldn't articulate the physics. First layer directly over that top linen sheet, another linen blanket or a very lightweight wool. This goes against your skin, or rather against the linen shift you're sleeping in. We'll get to your sleeping clothes in a bit. This inner layer is about moisture management as much as warmth. It creates a buffer zone that absorbs any sweat while being light enough not to trap you in your own humidity. You want warmth, not a sauna. Next comes wool, heavy wool. This is the workhorse of your blanket strategy. Wool blankets in medieval contexts weren't the soft processed things you buy at department stores. They were thick, often slightly coarse, woven on hand looms with varying degrees of skill. The weave was tight enough to trap air, but loose enough to allow some moisture to escape. You might have 2 or 3 wool blankets, depending on the depth of winter and your personal wealth. The wool colour varied. Natural sheep colours ranged from white to grey to brown to nearly black, and undyed wool was cheaper than dyed. If you had dyed wool blankets, you were making a statement, but lying in the dark with curtains drawn, nobody sees your blanket colours anyway. Function trumps fashion when you're trying not to freeze. Between the wool layers, some households placed what's called a vapour barrier, often a layer of oiled or waxed linen. This sounds counterintuitive because you want moisture to escape, but the theory was that a thin barrier layer prevented warmth from radiating outward, while still allowing moisture to wick sideways to the blanket edges. Did it work? Historians still argue about the actual effectiveness versus the placebo effect of feeling like you were doing something. On top of the wool blankets, if you're wealthy enough, comes fur. Not just any fur, specifically the fur is worn hair side down against the wool with the leather side facing up toward you. This matters enormously. The fur layer creates an incredibly effective insulation barrier because animal pelts evolved specifically to keep mammals warm in cold climates. You're essentially wrapping yourself in a dead animal's thermal protection system, and it works frighteningly well. Common furs included rabbit, squirrel, fox, and for the very wealthy marten or ermine. Bear fur was used but less common in bedding because it was so heavy and so expensive that it usually ended up as a wall hanging or floor covering. Each fur had different properties. Rabbit was affordable and decent. Squirrel especially. The grey winter pelts from northern forests was excellent and popular among middling nobility. Fox was warmer but smelled distinctly musky. Ermine was pure status, those white winter pelts, with black tail tips that you see in royal portraits. The fur coverlet wasn't a blanket in the sewn sense. It was often multiple pelts stitched together leather side up, creating a patchwork of animal skins that could be quite large, 6 feet by 6 feet or more. The leather side faced upward, partly because it was more durable against wear, but also because the smooth leather surface helped other blankets slide over it without catching on fur. Now here's where it gets heavy, literally. On top of everything else, there's often a quilted coverlet, 2 layers of fabric with wool batting between stitched-in patterns that keep the filling from shifting. This final layer is thick decorative, if you can afford embroidery, and weighs enough that you feel genuinely pinned to the mattress. The total weight of all these layers could easily be 15 to 20 pounds. You're not just warmed by this arrangement, you're compressed by it. The weight itself serves a function. It eliminates air pockets between layers, ensuring each blanket is pressed against the one below, minimizing gaps where heat could escape. It also prevents the blankets from shifting during the night. Once you're arranged under this textile architecture, you're not tossing and turning casually. Movement requires commitment. Medieval people understood the cocoon effect. The tight wrapping, the pressure, the enclosure, all of it contributed not just to warmth, but to a sense of security. Modern weighted blankets marketed for anxiety. Not a new concept. The deep pressure stimulation from heavy bedding was standard in medieval sleeping arrangements, though they didn't have a clinical term for it. The edges of these blankets typically tucked under the mattress sides, creating a sealed envelope. You didn't drape blankets loosely over yourself. You built a structure. The bottom sheet tucked under the blankets tucked under everything pulled tight and secured. This prevented drafts from sneaking in at the edges, and also maintained the layer integrity throughout the night. Different regions had slight variations. In Scandinavia and northern Germany, there was more emphasis on down-filled coverlets, essentially proto-duvets. In Mediterranean castle regions, fewer layers were needed, and sometimes a single heavy wool blanket sufficed. In England and northern France, the fur-over-wool combination was standard for anyone who could afford it. Changing the bedding seasonally was a significant household event. Around April or May, the heavy furs and extra wool blankets would be taken off, beaten clean, and stored with herbs to prevent moth damage. Lighter summer bedding would be brought out, fewer layers, lighter fabrics, sometimes just linen sheets, and one wool blanket for cool nights. Come October, the heavy bedding would be retrieved, aired out, checked for damage, and reinstalled. This wasn't casual, this was preparing for siege conditions just against winter rather than armies. You pull the first linen layer over yourself, now smoothing it down. Then the first wool blanket, heavy and slightly scratchy even through the linen. The weight settles over your chest, your legs. Already you can feel the difference. The blanket traps a layer of still air between you and the room. Another wool blanket. The weight increases. You're starting to feel the compression. If you have a fur coverlet tonight, you'd pull it up now, feeling the leather side cool against your hands, knowing that in minutes it'll warm from your body heat trapped beneath. Finally, the quilted top layer heavy enough that pulling it up requires effort. The weight is distributed across your entire body now. You're not just covered, you're architecturally enclosed in textile insulation. This is your thermal armor. This is how you'll survive the night. Not comfortably by modern standards, but adequately by the only standards that matter, alive versus frozen. And honestly, within a few minutes you'll start to feel warm. Not toasty, not cozy in a soft, gentle way, but definitively measurably warm. It's going to work. Before you even climbed into that bed, before you pulled back those curtains, you made a series of clothing decisions that will directly impact whether you wake up in the morning or become a cautionary tale about hypothermia. Because here's something modern people fundamentally misunderstand about medieval sleeping. You didn't undress for bed. You dressed for it. The idea of stripping down to skin or minimal clothing before sleep is a relatively modern luxury one that depends entirely on climate-controlled bedrooms. In your freezing stone chamber, removing clothes would be suicidal. Instead, you put on specific garments designed for nocturnal warmth, layering them with the same strategic intention you used for the blankets. Your base layer is a linen shift, essentially a long shirt that falls to your knees or below sometimes to your ankles. For men, this is called a chemise or shirt. For women, it's a smock or shift. Same concept, a loose-fitting linen garment worn against the skin. Linen is crucial here for the same reason it is in sheets. It wicks moisture away from your body. You're going to generate some sweat under all those blankets, and you need that moisture moved away from your skin or you'll wake up damp, which in a cold room is genuinely dangerous. Damp skin loses heat 25 times faster than dry skin. The shift is long-sleeved almost always. Short sleeves are for summer or for people who don't care about their extremities going numb. The sleeves might be loose or might be fitted at the wrist with a simple cuff. The neckline is usually a simple slit with ties or buttons, nothing fancy, nothing tight. This is utility clothing. Over the linen shift, many people added a wool undertunic or a second heavier shift, especially in deep winter. Wool against linen, never wool directly against skin, because wool can be itchy and irritating, but also because the linen layer manages moisture, while the wool layer provides insulation. Layering isn't just about thickness, it's about combining materials with different properties. Now we get to the extremities, which are where you lose heat fastest. Your head, your hands, your feet. These are thermal liability zones. Blood vessels are close to the surface, heat radiates away efficiently. And if they get too cold, your body starts restricting blood flow to preserve core temperature, which means numbness, pain, and potential frostbite in extreme cases. The nightcap is not a joke. It's not a cartoon stereotype. It's a genuine piece of survival equipment. A simple linen or wool cap that covers your head and ears, often tying under the chin to stay in place while you sleep. Some are close-fitting like a coif. Others are looser, almost bag-like, with enough room that they don't compress your hair, but still trap a layer of warm air around your scalp. You lose an enormous percentage of body heat through your head. Modern science has debunked the 50% of heat lost through your head myth, but you still lose significantly more heat per square inch from your head than from other body parts because you don't typically insulate it as well. Medieval people knew this experientially. Cold head equals miserable night. Nightcap solves problem. For your feet, there are options depending on wealth and severity of cold. Some people slept in their day hose, essentially wool stockings that go up to the knee or thigh. Others had specific sleeping hose lighter weight but still wool. The very wealthy might have wool socks or foot wrapping specifically for bed. The poor might wrap their feet in rags or extra fabric scraps. Almost nobody slept barefoot in winter unless they were too poor to have alternatives, and those people often suffered from chilblains, painful inflammation of the toes from repeated exposure to cold. Gloves or mittens for sleeping were less common, but not unheard of, especially for people with poor circulation or arthritis. More often, you'd tuck your hands under the blankets near your body, using your own torso as a heating source. But some surviving account books mention sleeping mittens, usually fingerless to allow some manual dexterity, if you needed to adjust blankets or deal with a candle in the night. Here's something that sounds bizarre. Until you think about it, some people slept in their day robes, especially on particularly brutal nights. The heavy wool or fur-lined robes worn during the day became an additional insulation layer at night. You'd climb into bed essentially fully dressed in your indoor clothing, then pile the blankets on top. The robe added bulk and trapped air, and if you needed to get up in the middle of the night, more on that later, you were already partially dressed for the cold expedition across your chamber. Women often kept their hair braided or bound up in a cloth for sleep. Loose hair could tangle, but more practically keeping it contained under a cap or wrapped in linen kept the back of your neck insulated. Hair itself isn't great insulation when it's just hanging loose, but compressed under fabric it adds a bit of warmth. There's a class distinction here that's worth noting. Wealthy nobles had the luxury of specific sleeping garments, fine linen shifts, embroidered nightcaps, dedicated sleeping robes. The poor made do with whatever they had, often sleeping in the same shift they'd worn all day, maybe adding extra layers if they owned them. The difference in survival rates during brutal winters correlated directly with access to appropriate clothing. Medieval medical texts sometimes recommended sleeping in clean linen changed regularly, because they believed that the body expelled bad humours during sleep, and those humours would contaminate fabric. Whether or not the theory was accurate, the practice of changing into fresh sleeping clothes when possible was probably beneficial from a hygiene standpoint, even if the reasoning was wrong. You're wearing all of this now, linen shift, wool, overlayer nightcap tied under your chin, wool hose on your feet. You feel bundled, slightly restricted in movement, but also noticeably warmer than you were before dressing for bed. The layers trap air against your skin. Your own body heat starts to accumulate in the fabric rather than radiating into the room. This is your sleeping armor textile insulation between your vulnerable human body and the relentless cold. And you're not done yet. You still have to climb under those 20 pounds of blankets and seal yourself into the curtained bed enclosure. But already dressed like this, you're measurably better equipped for survival than you would be in modern pyjamas or, God forbid, naked. Medieval people weren't tougher than you, they were just better dressed for the reality they faced. Now we arrive at one of the most practical and least romantic aspects of medieval sleeping arrangements, the reality that sleeping alone in winter was a privilege only fools and the suicidal could afford. Your bed, despite being designed for thermal efficiency, works exponentially better when occupied by multiple warm-blooded mammals. This isn't about intimacy or companionship, though those might be present. This is pure thermodynamics. A human body at rest generates approximately 100 watts of heat, as we mentioned earlier. 2 bodies generate 200 watts. 3 bodies, 300 watts. You see where this is going. In an enclosed space like your curtained bed, multiple bodies create a cumulative warming effect that a single person simply cannot achieve alone. The math is brutally simple. More bodies equals more heat, equals better survival odds. Married couples slept together, obviously, but this wasn't the romantic image of 2 people cuddling under a duvet. This was strategic heat sharing in a survival context. You and your spouse positioned yourselves to maximize thermal efficiency, often back-to-back or front-to-back, creating the largest possible surface area of contact. Body heat transfers through touch. The more contact, the more shared warmth. But it wasn't just spouses. Children slept with parents, especially young children and infants, who couldn't regulate their own body temperature effectively. The family bed was standard across all economic classes. A noble household might have the lord and lady in the centre, with young children tucked between them or along the edges. This wasn't considered strange or inappropriate, it was considered smart. Older children often shared beds with siblings, sometimes 3 or 4 to a bed. Servants shared sleeping spaces in even greater numbers. 6 to 8 people in a single large bed wasn't uncommon in servant quarters. The more bodies, the warmer the collective sleeping environment. Privacy was a luxury. Warmth was a necessity. Necessity won. There was an actual hierarchy to bed positioning based on thermal vulnerability. The weakest members, infants, the elderly, the sick, got the warmest spots, typically in the centre of the bed, where they'd benefit from body heat on both sides. Healthier adults took the outer positions, acting as thermal buffers between the vulnerable centre and the cold edges. This wasn't altruism, it was survival strategy. Losing a child or an elderly parent to cold was both a personal tragedy and an economic disaster for the household. Guest arrangements followed similar logic. When you had visitors staying in your castle, they weren't necessarily given private rooms unless they were of extremely high status. More often, guests of similar rank shared beds. 2 visiting knights might bunk together. Travelling merchants shared sleeping space. This was expected. Account books and household records routinely mention putting up guests in ways that clearly indicate shared sleeping arrangements. There are documented cases of complete strangers sharing beds in inns and way stations. You'd pay for a space in a bed, not the entire bed. The innkeeper would fill beds to capacity, sometimes 4 or 5 strangers arranged side by side like sardines. Your travelling cloak served as your personal boundary wrapped around yourself to create some minimal separation from the stranger next to you, but you still benefited from their body heat, and they from yours. This creates some fascinating social dynamics. Sharing a bed required trust or at least resignation. There were etiquette rules, you didn't steal blankets, you didn't thrash around unnecessarily, you maintained some decorum. Medieval conduct books actually addressed bed sharing, etiquette, advising people not to snore too loudly, not to hog the best sleeping position, and to be considerate of your bed partner's comfort. Now here's where it gets really interesting, dogs. Not just any dogs, specifically large dogs bred for hunting or guarding. These animals were walking furnaces, and medieval nobles knew it. A hunting hound weighing 70 or 80 pounds generates significant heat. Allow that dog onto your bed, and you've just added another thermal unit to your sleeping arrangement. Dogs on the bed wasn't considered dirty or inappropriate in the way it might be viewed in some modern contexts. It was practical. The dog got to sleep somewhere warm. You got additional heat. Everyone benefited. Some nobles had multiple dogs on the bed, 2 or 3 hounds arranged at the foot or along the sides, providing supplemental warmth to the human occupants. There are account records mentioning specific dogs being kept for their warming properties. Smaller breeds, what we'd now call lapdogs, were favoured by women and elderly people precisely because they could be held close tucked under blankets, positioned against the chest or stomach, where they'd radiate heat into the core body. These weren't pampered pets in the modern sense. They were functional heating devices that also happened to be loyal companions. Cats served a similar purpose, though their smaller size meant less heat output. But a cat curled against your stomach or chest still provided noticeable warmth, and they had the added benefit of killing mice and rats, which were constant problems in castle environments. A good mousing cat earned its keep multiple ways. Historians still argue about whether the health benefits of animal warmth outweighed the hygiene costs, fleas, parasites, the general uncleanliness of animals that spent their days outdoors. But in the immediate calculus of freeze to death versus share bed with the dog won every time. You could deal with fleas, you couldn't deal with hypothermia. Servants sleeping in your chamber was also common, particularly for high-status nobles, body servants. The people who dressed you, attended you, often slept on pallets on the floor of your chamber, or even at the foot of your bed. This served multiple purposes. They were available. If you needed something during the night, they provided additional bodies warming the chamber air slightly, and their presence added security. Some noble children had nurses or attendants who slept in the same bed with them, specifically to keep them warm and monitor them through the night. Infant mortality was high, and one contributing factor was cold exposure. Having an adult body in the bed with an infant meant the child was less likely to suffer dangerous temperature drops during sleep. The cumulative effect of all these bodies, human and animal, transformed the sleeping environment. What started as a freezing stone chamber with a solitary bed became a collective thermal zone where multiple heat sources combined to create survivable conditions. The bed curtains trapped this accumulated warmth. The blankets sealed it in, and morning arrived with everyone still breathing. You're not alone in your bed tonight. Maybe it's your spouse beside you, maybe a child tucked between you, maybe a large hound stretched across the foot of the mattress, its rhythmic breathing a reassurance in the darkness. Maybe a servant on a pallet nearby, their presence a soft sound in the stillness. You're warmer for it, measurably significantly warmer. And in a medieval winter, that difference isn't comfort, it's survival. Before you even think about settling into sleep, there's a ritual of preparation that occupies the last hour before you climb under those blankets. This isn't just busy work. It's a carefully orchestrated sequence of actions designed to pre-warm your sleeping environment and your body, because starting cold means staying cold, and staying cold means a miserable, dangerous night. The warming pan is your primary weapon in this pre-sleep campaign. It's a long-handled brass or copper pan, shallow, with a perforated lid specifically designed to hold hot coals or embers. The handle extends 3 or 4 feet, allowing you to maneuver the pan deep into your bed without burning yourself or setting the fabric on fire, both of which are real risks that require genuine attention. A servant fills the pan with embers from the fireplace, glowing red coals that radiate serious heat. Then comes the careful process of sliding this ember-filled device between your sheets, moving it systematically across the entire sleeping surface. You're not just warming one spot, you're heating the linen, the mattress layers beneath, driving out the bone-deep cold that's accumulated in the fabric and stuffing throughout the day. This takes time, 10 minutes, maybe 15 if you're thorough. The pan moves slowly from the head of the bed toward the foot, then back again, covering the width of the mattress in overlapping passes. You can smell the warming linen, a distinctive scent like sun-dried fabric, even though it's the middle of winter and there's been no sun for weeks. The mattress itself begins to release a warm, slightly musty smell as heat drives moisture out of the wool or feather stuffing. The sheets, when you finally slide between them after the warming pan has done its work, feel almost hot against your skin, a shocking contrast to the freezing chamber air. That warmth won't last all night, but it gives you a crucial head start. Your body doesn't have to fight from a deficit. You're starting warm, and your job is simply to maintain that warmth through the night. Some households used hot stones instead of, or in addition to, warming pans. Smooth river rocks or purpose-cut stones would be heated in the fireplace for hours, then wrapped in cloth and placed at the foot of the bed or along the sides. These held heat longer than embers. A good-sized stone could stay warm for 3 or 4 hours. You'd position your feet against a wrapped hot stone, and the radiant warmth would keep your extremities from going numb during the critical first hours of sleep. The wealthy had dedicated stone bed warmers carved from soapstone or similar materials that retained heat well. These weren't common, but they appear in some household inventories. A properly heated soapstone bed warmer, wrapped in wool, could provide gentle warmth for 5 or 6 hours. You'd wake up in the middle of the night and it would still be noticeably warm to the touch. There was real danger in this pre-warming process. Hot coals or stones could set bedding on fire if not properly contained. There are documented cases of fatal fires started by warming pans left too long in one place, or coals falling through a damaged pan lid onto straw mattresses. The straw would smoulder, then ignite, and with all those fabric layers the bed would become an inferno before anyone noticed. This is why the warming pan ritual required attention, not casual negligence. You didn't just toss hot coals into the bed and walk away. You monitored, you moved the pan constantly, you checked for stray embers. The servant who performed this task was trusted, trained, and understood the stakes. After the bed was warmed, there was often a pre-sleep drink, something hot, something that would generate internal warmth to complement the external preparations. Mulled wine was common among the nobility, red wine heated with spices, maybe honey, if you had it served in a wooden or ceramic cup that wouldn't burn your hands. The spices weren't just for flavour. Cinnamon cloves, ginger. These were believed to have warming properties to stimulate the body's internal heat. Medieval medicine operated on the theory of humours and qualities, with foods and drinks classified as hot, cold, wet or dry. Wine was hot and dry. Adding warming spices made it hotter. Drinking it before bed was thought to raise your internal temperature, preparing your body for the cold night ahead. Some people preferred heated ale, which was cheaper and more readily available than wine. Ale warmed with a hot poker and iron rod heated in the fire, then plunged into the liquid would foam and hiss dramatically, creating a drink that was almost too hot to swallow comfortably. But that was the point. You wanted heat. You wanted to feel warmth spreading from your stomach outward. There are recipes in medieval household books for specific sleeping drinks, possets made with hot milk ale, wine, sometimes eggs, spices, even small amounts of bread for substance. These weren't recreational beverages. They were medicinal preparations designed to promote sleep and maintain body warmth through the night. The drinking ritual also served a psychological function. Sitting by the fire, if you had one in your chamber or in the hall, before retiring, sipping something warm, you were marking the transition from active day to passive night. Your body received the signal, warmth is coming, rest is permitted, you can stop being vigilant now. Some households had a tradition of warming night clothes by the fire before putting them on. Your linen shift, your wool overlay, your nightcap, all of it hung near the hearth for the last hour of evening, absorbing radiant heat. When you put them on, they felt almost hot against your skin, another layer of pre-warming that gave you an advantage against the cold. Wealthy households sometimes warmed the bedchamber itself, or attempted to by moving a brazier into the room an hour before bedtime. A brazier is essentially a metal basket on legs filled with hot coals, radiating heat into the surrounding air. It couldn't warm the entire room, that was impossible, but it could take the edge off the worst cold, raising the ambient temperature by a few crucial degrees. Braziers were dangerous though. Carbon monoxide poisoning was a real risk in enclosed spaces with poor ventilation, and stone rooms, while they had drafts, didn't always have adequate air exchange. There are medieval medical texts that describe symptoms of what we'd now recognise as CO poisoning, headaches, dizziness, nausea, attributed to bad air from improperly ventilated heating sources, so brazier use was carefully managed. You'd warm the room, then remove the brazier before sealing yourself into the curtained bed for the night. Or you'd position it far enough from the bed that the fumes wouldn't accumulate in your breathing space, but close enough that some radiant heat reached you. All of these preparations, the warming pan, the hot stones, the spiced drink, the pre-warmed clothes, required planning, resources, and labour. This is another point where class stratification becomes obvious. The wealthy had servants to manage all of this. The poor had to choose spend time and fuel on pre-warming, or just climb into a cold bed and suffer through it. Most chose suffering because fuel was expensive and time was limited. The elaborate pre-sleep warming ritual was a privilege, but it was also enormously effective. Starting warm meant you could fall asleep faster, sleep more deeply, and wake up in better condition. The difference was significant enough that it probably impacted health outcomes over the long term. You've drunk your warm spiced wine. The bed has been thoroughly heated with the warming pan. Your sleeping clothes were warmed by the fire and are still holding residual heat. You're as prepared as you're going to be. Now comes the final step, climbing and pulling the curtains and sealing yourself into your textile fortress for the duration of the night. The cold is still out there waiting, but you've done everything possible to keep it at bay. Let's talk about the fireplace, because if you're lucky enough to have one in your sleeping chamber, you need to understand both its promise and its profound limitations. That hearth across the room with its remaining embers glowing dully in the darkness represents one of the great thermal paradoxes of medieval castle life, a heat source that somehow manages to warm almost nothing. The problem is physics-specifically radiant heat distribution and the behavior of warm air in large cold spaces. Your fireplace heats primarily through radiation infrared energy, travelling in straight lines from the burning wood or coals. If you're standing directly in front of the fire, you feel wonderfully warm. Step 3 feet to either side and the warmth drops dramatically. Move 6 feet away and you might as well be outside. Radiant heat doesn't bend around corners. It doesn't fill a room uniformly. It shoots out in straight lines from the heat source, and anything not in the direct line of sight gets nothing. So your fireplace warms the air and stone directly in front of it, and maybe if you're optimistic, a cone-shaped zone extending out about 4 or 5 feet. The rest of your chamber remains brutally cold. Then there's the convection problem. Hot air rises. This is wonderful if you're trying to heat a small, low-ceilinged room. This is a disaster if you're in a castle chamber with a 12-foot ceiling. The warmest air in your room is currently hovering uselessly near the ceiling, well above your head, doing absolutely nothing for your sleeping body 6 feet below. Meanwhile, cold air, denser, heavier settles at floor level, so you have thermal stratification, warm air up high, cold air down low, and the temperature gradient between them can be dramatic. The air near your ceiling might be 60 degrees, the air at mattress level might be 45. You're sleeping in the cold layer. The chimney itself is part of the problem. Yes, it vents smoke, which is essential. You'd die of smoke inhalation without it. But it also acts as a giant exhaust pipe, pulling warm air out of your room and venting it outside. The draft required to keep smoke flowing up and out also means you're constantly losing heated air. The fireplace is simultaneously warming your room and evacuating the warmth it creates. The inefficiency is staggering. Medieval fireplaces weren't designed with efficiency in mind. They were designed to burn fuel and vent smoke. The massive stone fireplace openings you see in castles, some large enough to walk into, look impressive but are thermally useless. All that exposed stone surface area radiates cold back into the room. The huge opening allows massive heat loss, and the straight-through chimney design without any baffles or heat retention features sends the majority of the fire's energy straight up and out into the night sky. Some later medieval improvements tried to address this. Smaller fireplace openings, angled backs that reflected more heat into the room, metal firebacks, cast iron plates positioned at the rear of the firebox that absorbed heat and radiated it back out more effectively than stone. But these innovations came late, and not every castle had them. Most nobles were sleeping in chambers with thermally inefficient fireplaces that were barely better than no fireplace at all. Here's another thing, maintaining a fire through the night required fuel, and fuel was expensive. Wood had to be cut, transported, dried, and stored. A night-long fire could consume an astonishing amount of wood, easily 50 or 60 pounds, possibly more, if you wanted substantial heat output. That's not trivial. That's a significant portion of your annual fuel budget. So most people didn't maintain full fires through the night. They'd bank the fire before bed, arranging coals and partially burned logs in a way that created a slow burn with minimal flame. This produced some heat, but nothing like the roaring fire you might imagine. More often, the goal was simply to keep embers alive until morning so you could restart the fire without the labour of relighting from scratch. Banking a fire was a genuine skill. Too much air and it burned too hot, consuming fuel wastefully. Too little air and it went out completely. You needed the right arrangement of coals, the right size and type of wood, sometimes a covering of ash to slow the burn rate. Servants who were good at banking fires were valued because a successfully banked fire meant easier mornings. The fire's light was another consideration. Even a low fire produces flickering light that can disturb sleep. So in addition to thermal management, there was the question of whether you wanted light in the room all night. Some people found it comforting. The glow of embers meant the fire was alive. Warmth was theoretically available. Others found it disruptive and preferred complete darkness. Smoke was an ever-present issue. Even with a functioning chimney, some smoke always escaped into the room. The smell permeated everything, your bed curtains, your clothes, your hair. You didn't notice it after a while because you were saturated with it, but visitors to your chamber would smell it immediately. Wood smoke was the olfactory signature of medieval indoor life. Different woods produced different smoke characteristics. Oak burned hot and long but created acrid smoke. Pine had resin that smoked heavily and created creosote build-up in chimneys. Birch burned clean but fast. Ash was prized because it burned relatively clean and hot. but you burned what you had access to, and most households used mixed wood, whatever was available from estate forests or purchased from fuel merchants. The fireplace's position in the room mattered enormously. Ideally, it was on an interior wall, so at least some of the heat it generated warmed stone that faced into other parts of the castle, rather than directly to the exterior. But many fireplaces were on exterior walls for easier chimney construction, which meant much of their heat was warming stone that then radiated it straight outside. Terrible design from a thermal perspective, but easier to build. Historians still argue about how many castle bedrooms actually had fireplaces, versus how many people relied solely on portable heating, like braziers or just the insulation of bed and blankets. Fireplace construction was expensive, both initially and in ongoing fuel costs. Lower-ranking nobles and knights might have one fireplace in their main hall and none in private chambers. You'd warm yourself in the hall, then retreat to your unheated chamber and rely entirely on bed engineering for warmth. There's evidence that some people moved their sleeping locations seasonally to track available heat sources. In deep winter, entire households might sleep in or near the Great Hall, where the large central hearth could be kept burning. Private chambers were abandoned for the worst months considered uninhabitable, even with fireplaces of their own. You're looking at your fireplace now, watching the embers pulse slightly as air moves through the chamber. There's a tiny amount of heat reaching you, but it's negligible compared to the cold radiating from the stone walls around you. The fire is comforting. Psychologically, humans have been drawn to fire for hundreds of thousands of years, but practically, it's doing almost nothing for your sleeping comfort. You could get up, cross the cold floor, add more wood, coax it into flame. That would give you maybe an hour of better heat before it died back down to embers again. Or you could accept that the fire has done what it can, and trust instead to the bed, the curtains, the blankets, the body heat you'll share with whoever is sleeping beside you. Most nights you choose the latter. The fire can glow or die as it wishes. Your warmth will come from textile engineering and mammalian biology, not from that false promise of flames across the room. Now look at the walls around you. Really look at them. Those aren't just decorative hangings draped across the stone. Those tapestries, those heavy woven panels depicting hunting scenes or biblical narratives or abstract patterns, are serving a function far more critical than aesthetics. Their insulation infrastructure removable walls of fabric, creating an air gap between you and the thermal nightmare of bare stone. The physics here is elegant in its simplicity. Stone conducts heat efficiently, which means cold from outside passes through your 3-foot-thick walls and radiates into your chamber. But air, particularly still-trapped air, is an excellent insulator. Hang heavy fabric 6 inches away from the wall, and you've created a dead air space that interrupts the thermal transfer. The cold still radiates from the stone, but now it's heating that trapped air pocket, instead of directly heating the room air you're breathing. The difference is measurable. A room with tapestries can be several degrees warmer than the same room with bare walls. Not dramatically warmer, we're talking maybe 3 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit, but when the baseline temperature is already near freezing, every degree matters enormously. That's the difference between water freezing in your washing basin overnight or not, between your breath condensing visibly or not, between tolerable and genuinely dangerous. Tapestries were expensive, staggeringly expensive, if they were quality pieces with complex designs and fine wool or silk. A single large tapestry could cost more than a warhorse, more than a year's income for a minor knight. The really elaborate ones, woven with metallic threads or imported dyes, were investments comparable to land purchases. But even crude, simple wool hangings provided insulation value, and most households had something on the walls for exactly this reason. The weaving technique mattered. Tightly woven tapestries with dense thread counts trapped more air and blocked drafts better than loose weaves. The best ones were heavy enough that they hung straight without billowing, creating a consistent air gap. Lighter fabrics tended to move with air currents, disrupting the dead airspace and reducing effectiveness. Installation was deliberate. Tapestries weren't just nailed up randomly. They were hung on wooden battens or rods positioned several inches out from the wall, held by iron hooks or wooden pegs. The goal was maximum coverage with minimum attachment points, allowing the fabric to create that insulating air pocket along as much wall surface as possible. Corners and edges were particular challenges. You wanted minimal gaps where cold air could infiltrate behind the tapestry. Some households doubled up tapestries in winter, hanging a second layer over the first to create even more insulation. The gap between the two fabric layers trapped additional air. You sacrificed some of the visual detail 2 layers of fabric muted the imagery, but you gained warmth. Form followed function when survival was at stake. The tapestries also blocked drafts directly. Medieval stone walls, despite being 3 feet thick, weren't perfectly sealed. Mortar deteriorated. Stones shifted slightly over time. Tiny gaps appeared, and through those gaps wind infiltrated. A tapestry-covered wall was less drafty than bare stone simply because the fabric caught and dissipated air movement before it reached the living space. There's an interesting class marker here. The quality and quantity of wall coverings directly correlated with wealth and status. A great hall might have floor-to-ceiling tapestries covering every wall depicting elaborate narrative scenes. These were statement pieces showing off both wealth and cultural sophistication. A minor noble's bedroom might have simpler woolen hangings, maybe just geometric patterns or single-colour fabric. The very poor had nothing, or at best some old fabric scraps hung over the draftiest sections. But even simple hangings helped. Plain wool fabric undyed no decorative elements whatsoever, just wool cloth hung 6 inches from the wall still created that critical air gap. The insulation physics didn't care whether the fabric showed scenes from the life of Christ, or was just raw textile. Trapped air is trapped air. Maintenance was constant. Tapestries collected dust, absorbed cooking smoke, and fireplace smoke became homes for insects. They needed to be taken down, periodically beaten clean-checked for moth damage and rehung. This was major household work usually done in late spring or early summer, when the tapestries could be taken outside, beaten thoroughly aired in the sun, and inspected for repairs. Damaged tapestries lost effectiveness. A tear or hole allowed air to pass through, disrupting the insulation layer. Moth damage was particularly insidious. The insects ate the wool fibres, creating weak spots and eventually holes. Wealthy households stored tapestries with strong-smelling herbs like lavender or wormwood to discourage moths, but this was only partially effective. Seasonal rotation was common in well-managed households. Heavy winter tapestries came down in late spring and were replaced with lighter summer hangings, sometimes just painted cloth or linen panels that provided decoration without the heavy insulation you didn't need in warm months. Come October or November, the winter tapestries came back out of storage, and the serious work of wall covering began again. The imagery on tapestries sometimes reflected their insulation function. Scenes of gardens, flowers, greenery. These were popular precisely because they created a psychological counterpoint to the reality of winter. You're in a freezing stone chamber, but the walls show you eternal summer blooming roses. Ladies walking in sunshine. It's a mental warmth, even if the physical warmth is marginal. Religious imagery served similar psychological purposes. Scenes of saints, biblical narratives, depictions of heaven, these provided spiritual comfort and reinforced the idea that physical suffering was temporary, that warmth and peace awaited in the afterlife. Whether this actually helped people tolerate the cold is debatable, but the imagery was ubiquitous in medieval chambers. Some tapestries included practical scenes, hunting, feasting, daily life that served as both decoration and subtle household instruction. They reinforced social hierarchies and proper behaviour while also covering cold walls, education and insulation combined. Historians still argue about whether the primary function of tapestries was insulation or status display. The answer is probably both inextricably linked. You needed wall coverings for warmth, so why not make them beautiful and impressive? The practical necessity created an opportunity for artistic and social expression. But make no mistake, if you had to choose between an ugly tapestry and a bare wall, you chose the tapestry every time. Beauty was nice, warmth was survival. You're surrounded by these textile walls, now heavy wool or linen panels, hanging in the shadows beyond your candlelight. You can't see them clearly, but you know they're there, creating those critical air pockets between you and the stone. They're not keeping you warm, your bed will do that, but they're keeping the room marginally less hostile. And in a medieval winter, marginally less hostile is sometimes the best you can hope for. Now let's address the elephant in the freezing room. Those windows. Actually, let's be honest, they're less like windows and more like architectural wounds in your walls, thermal hemorrhage points that bleed heat with relentless efficiency. Every window in your chamber represents a fundamental compromise between the human need for light and the physical reality that openings in walls are terrible for heat retention. The evolution of castle windows tells a story of competing priorities. Early Norman keeps had tiny slit windows, arrow loops designed for defence. These were maybe 18 inches tall, 6 inches wide on the interior, narrowing to just a few inches on the exterior. Terrible for light, terrible for views, but actually decent for keeping heat in because the surface area was minimal. An arrow slit doesn't leak much warmth, because there's barely any opening to leak through. But by the 13th and 14th centuries, residential castle architecture shifted. People wanted more light. They wanted to see outside. Status demanded larger windows. Bigger windows meant you could afford the heat loss, which was itself a flex of wealth. So windows grew. Some became quite large, especially in private chambers and solar rooms with multiple lancets, or even early Gothic tracery. The problem, of course, is that glass technology was primitive. Window glass existed, but creating large clear panes was beyond medieval manufacturing capability. What you got instead were small pieces, maybe 6 inches by 8 inches of uneven, bubbly greenish glass with terrible optical clarity. These small panes were held together by lead cames, H-shaped lead strips that created a framework, essentially a honeycomb of small glass pieces. Even when fully glazed, these windows leaked air ferociously. The lead joints weren't airtight. The glass panes themselves didn't fit perfectly. Temperature changes caused expansion and contraction, creating gaps. Wind pressure pushed air through any available crack. A glazed window was better than an open hole, but not by as much as you'd hope. And glass was expensive, genuinely prohibitively expensive for anyone below the highest nobility. Most castle windows, even in relatively wealthy households, used alternative materials or simply remained unglazed with shutters as the only barrier. Oiled linen or oiled parchment stretched across window openings was far more common than glass. You'd take linen fabric, soak it in linseed oil, or another oil, let it dry and stretch it taut across a wooden frame fitted into the window opening. The oil made the linen translucent, not transparent, but enough that light could pass through. It created a diffuse soft illumination rather than clear views. The advantage was cost. Oiled linen was affordable, relatively easy to make, and provided some wind resistance. The disadvantage was durability. Weather deteriorated it. The oil eventually dried out and the linen became brittle. In freezing conditions, the fabric could crack. It needed replacement every few years, sometimes more often. Oiled parchment worked similarly, but was slightly more durable and allowed even less light through. Some windows used horn-thin slices of cow horn heated and flattened that provided semi-translucent panels. Horn was tougher than linen, but even more expensive and labour-intensive to produce. Most windows, most of the time, relied primarily on wooden shutters. These were the real barriers against cold. Heavy oak planks, sometimes 2 or 3 inches thick, hung on iron hinges and fitted into the window recess as snugly as medieval carpentry could manage. When closed, they blocked almost all light and most of the draught. But here's the cruel paradox: close the shutters, and you're in darkness. Open them for light, and you're allowing massive heat loss. This wasn't a small trade-off. An open window could drop your chamber temperature by 10 or 15 degrees within an hour. So you faced a daily calculation. How much do I need to see? How much cold can I tolerate? Is the light worth the lost warmth? Most people kept shutters closed most of the time during winter. You'd open them for a few hours during the brightest part of the day, roughly noon to mid-afternoon, to get some natural light, then close them again as soon as the sun started to decline. Those few hours of light had to sustain you through the long darkness. Wealthy households sometimes had layered window coverings, shutters on the outside, oiled linen panels in the middle, and fabric curtains on the inside. This created multiple barriers, each contributing some insulation value. The curtains alone were often heavy wool hung on rods inside the window recess, providing another layer of trapped air between the actual window and the room interior. Window seats. Those charming architectural features you see in castles weren't primarily about creating cosy reading nooks. They were about making the window recess deeper, creating more space for layered coverings and more distance between the exterior opening and the interior room. A window seat 3 feet deep meant 3 feet of insulated buffer zone. Some window recesses had small shutters that could be opened independently, a small section for minimal light and ventilation, while keeping the majority of the opening closed. This gave you options between fully sealed darkness and completely open vulnerability. The orientation of windows mattered enormously. South-facing windows in the northern hemisphere received more direct sun, which could actually provide meaningful solar heating during winter days. North-facing windows received no direct sun and were pure heat loss. East windows got morning light, but then became thermal drains. West windows caught afternoon sun, but also afternoon wind. Smart castle design, when it happened, placed the most important residential rooms, bedchamber solar rooms, on the south side of the castle, where they'd benefit from maximum solar gain. Service areas, storage rooms, lesser chambers ended up on the north side where the lack of sun mattered less. But castle layout was often dictated by defensive needs topography and pre-existing structures rather than optimal solar orientation. You got the windows you got based on where your chamber happened to be located, and you adapted. Frost on interior window surfaces was normal. The cold glass or wooden shutters would be below freezing, and moisture from room air, from breathing from any heating source, would condense and freeze on the cold surfaces. You'd wake up to intricate ice crystal patterns on the inside of your windows. Beautiful, yes. Also a clear demonstration that the barrier between you and exterior, freezing temperatures was very, very thin. Some mornings the frost was thick enough that opening shutters required chipping away ice that had sealed them shut. The wood-absorbed moisture expanded and froze in place. You needed tools, a knife or metal implement to break the ice seal before the shutters would move. Historians still argue whether the psychological impact of being sealed in darkness for 18 hours a day contributed to medieval depression and mood disorders. Modern research on seasonal affective disorder suggests that lack of natural light has real mental health impacts. Medieval people didn't have that framework, but they certainly experienced the effects. You're looking at your shuttered window now, just a dark rectangle in the stone wall, barely visible in your guttering candlelight. Outside is either darkness or moonlight. You can't tell which because the shutters are firmly closed, sealed against the night. You could open them, look out at the winter landscape, see the stars if the sky is clear. But that would mean cold air flooding in the chamber, temperature plummeting, and all your careful pre-warming efforts destroyed in minutes. So the shutters stay closed, the darkness stays complete, and you accept that until morning your world is this stone chamber, this candlelit space, this small defended territory against the infinite cold outside. The window is sealed, the cold is locked out, for now. Here's something most people don't realize about medieval castle living. You didn't just have one bedroom that you used year-round like some kind of thermal masochist. If you had the space and the status, you migrated through the castle, seasonally following the sun like a migratory bird tracking warmth across continents. This wasn't eccentricity, this was survival strategy refined over generations. Castle layouts weren't designed with uniform habitability in mind. Different sections, different towers, different floors, all had wildly varying thermal characteristics depending on their orientation, their height, their exposure to wind, and their relationship to heat sources. A chamber that was tolerable in October could become genuinely uninhabitable by January. So you moved. Summer chambers were typically on upper floors, often in towers where height meant better airflow and cooling breezes. These rooms might have larger windows to catch wind, higher ceilings to allow hot air to rise away from your body, and less concern about insulation because you weren't trying to retain heat, you were trying to shed it. Stone walls that were your enemy in winter became your ally in summer, radiating coolness inward from their thermal mass. But come autumn, those same upper chambers turned hostile. Height meant exposure to wind. Large windows became heat loss disasters. High ceilings meant any warmth generated immediately rose out of reach. Tower rooms surrounded on all sides by exterior walls became frozen stone cylinders. Time to migrate. Winter chambers were typically lower in the castle, ideally on an interior floor with other occupied rooms on multiple sides. You wanted to be surrounded by other inhabited spaces because every adjacent room with human activity was contributing some warmth. Even unheated rooms were warmer than exterior air, and that temperature differential provided insulation value. Ground floor rooms were sometimes preferred despite the status implications of not being elevated simply because rising heat from lower levels could provide minimal warming. If there was a great hall with a substantial hearth on the floor below you, some of that heat would conduct up through the stone. Not much stone is a decent insulator in some ways, but enough to matter at the margins. Proximity to the kitchen was valuable in winter. The kitchen was one of the warmest spaces in any castle because the cooking fires burned all day. A chamber adjacent to or above the kitchen benefited from that constant heat source. The smell of cooking smoke was inescapable, but that was a small price for being measurably warmer. Some nobles had winter apartments, a cluster of smaller rooms rather than one large chamber because smaller spaces were easier to heat and maintain warm. You'd retreat into a more compact living arrangement, sacrificing the spaciousness of summer quarters for better thermal management. Less volume meant your body heat, and any heating source had less space to warm. The seasonal migration wasn't just about moving your body from one room to another. It involved moving your possessions, your furniture, your bedding, your household goods. Everything that defined your personal space had to be transported. For wealthy nobles, this meant servants hauling beds, chests, tapestries, clothing dishes, candles, everything from the summer chamber to the winter chamber in a miniature household moving operation. This happened twice a year in well-organised households. Spring migration, usually around April or May, depending on climate, meant moving back to the lighter, airier summer quarters. Autumn migration, October or November, meant retreating to the defensible winter position. Some castles had explicit architectural features supporting this. Storage rooms near seasonal chambers where off-season furniture and belongings could be kept. Service corridors allowing servants to move goods without disrupting the household's daily functions. Even specialised sleeping chambers called winter halls, designed specifically for cold weather occupation. The concept of a permanent personal bedroom is largely modern. Medieval nobles thought in terms of seasonal occupation of spaces. Your summer identity might be associated with the tower room with views of the estate. Your winter identity retreated to the smaller, darker but warmer chamber near the kitchen block. Children and elderly family members often moved to the most thermally favourable spaces regardless of status implications. Keeping the vulnerable warm trumped maintaining hierarchical room assignments. A grandmother might occupy the warmest chamber in winter, even if it was technically below her status simply because cold killed the elderly efficiently. Guests presented interesting challenges. When visitors arrived in winter, where did you put them? Assigning them to a cold high-status chamber could be seen as inhospitable, possibly even malicious. But giving them your warmest space displaced your own household. Household management texts from the period actually discussed these dilemmas, suggesting strategies for guest placement that balanced honour and survival. Some castles had dedicated guest quarters designed for year-round habitability, smaller rooms with better insulation, proximity to heat sources and more modest windows. These weren't the grandest spaces, but they were functional, and a smart guest appreciated warmth over ostentation. The seasonal migration also involved adjusting the rooms themselves, adding extra tapestries in winter chambers, installing brazier stands, bringing in additional stored firewood, placing draft excluders at doors. The room had to be prepared for winter occupation, not just passively inhabited. Conversely, summer preparation meant removing heavy textiles to prevent moth damage and mildew opening shutters that had been closed for months, airing out accumulated smoke and human habitation smells. Cleaning crews would scrub floors, walls replace rushes or floor coverings, essentially refresh the space after months of neglect. Historians still argue about how universally this seasonal migration was practiced. Certainly the highest nobility did it. There are extensive household accounts documenting these moves. Lesser nobles with smaller castles might not have had multiple appropriate spaces and just toughed it out in one location year-round, managing as best they could. The very poorest knights with single-tower fortifications barely above substantial houses in scale had no migration options. You had the one chamber and it served all year. The seasonal variation in comfort must have been brutal, but you didn't have alternatives. There's an interesting psychological dimension here. Modern people tend to think of their bedroom as a fixed permanent personal space, an extension of identity. Medieval nobles thought of chambers as temporary occupancy zones, spaces you inhabited when appropriate and abandoned when conditions changed. The space didn't define you. Your ability to adaptively use space defined you. Right now, you're in what this castle considers a viable winter chamber. The room placement, the wall thickness, the relationship to other inhabited spaces, all of it was calculated to make this particular stone box the least terrible option for sleeping during the cold months. Come April, you'll probably abandon this room entirely, move to a different chamber with better light and air, and this space will sit unused until next October. The bed will stay too heavy to move easily. The tapestries might come down for summer storage, but the room itself will be surrendered to whatever temperature it wants to be, because you won't be here to care. But that's April. Right now it's deep winter, and this room with all its limitations is the best thermal option available to you. You're sleeping here because everywhere else is worse. That's not comforting exactly. But it's strategic, and strategy is what keeps you alive. Now we need to talk about something that happens to almost everyone in medieval sleeping conditions, something so universal that it shaped the entire structure of the night you're not going to sleep straight through until morning. That's not failure, that's not insomnia. That's actually the default pattern of human sleep before the modern era, and understanding it changes everything about how you approach the night ahead. The pattern was called segmented sleep, or sometimes first sleep and second sleep, and it was documented across medieval Europe with remarkable consistency. You'd go to bed shortly after dark, maybe around 8 or 9 in the evening in winter when darkness came early. You'd sleep for 3 to 4 hours in what was called your first sleep, then you'd wake up. Not because something disturbed you, not because you had to use the chamber pot, though you might. You'd wake up naturally completely around midnight or 1 in the morning, and you'd be awake for an hour, sometimes 2, fully conscious, alert, active. This wasn't groggily checking the time and rolling over. This was a distinct period of wakefulness in the middle of the night. Then you'd return to bed for your second sleep another 3 to 4 hours, waking naturally around dawn. 2 distinct sleep periods separated by a wakeful interval. This was normal. This was expected. This was how human sleep worked before artificial lighting extended the day and compressed our sleep into a single consolidated block. The midnight waking period had its own culture. People did things during these hours. Prayers were common. The Catholic Church had specific prayers designated for the middle of the night, acknowledging that the faithful would be awake then. You'd lie in bed, or perhaps sit up and recite prayers in the darkness. This was considered a particularly holy time, the quiet hours when the world was still, and your soul could commune with God. Some people got out of bed entirely. They'd check the fire add wood if it had burned too low, stir the coals back to life. In winter, this was crucial. Letting the fire die completely meant the morning would start with the laborious process of relighting from scratch. Tending the fire during the midnight wake was practical household management. Others used the time for conversation. If you shared your bed with a spouse, the period between first and second sleep was recognised as a time for intimate discussion. Not necessarily sexual intimacy, though that happened too, but quiet conversation, the exchange of thoughts and concerns that didn't fit into the busy daylight hours. Medieval household advice actually mentioned this, suggesting that the midnight period was ideal for discussing family matters privately. Some people ate light snacks. There are references in household accounts to midnight provisions, bread cheese ale left accessible for the wakeful hours. Not a full meal, but something to nibble on if you were hungry. The body burns calories fighting cold all night, and a small infusion of fuel during the midnight wake made sense. Reading for those who were literate and wealthy enough to have books was another common midnight activity. But this required either maintaining a candle through the first sleep, wasteful and potentially dangerous, or relighting one from the banked fire embers. Most people probably didn't bother. The darkness was complete, and stumbling around lighting candles risked accidents. Some simply lay awake thinking. Medieval people didn't have the modern anxiety about wakefulness being somehow wrong or problematic. The midnight wake was expected, accepted, even valued. It was quiet time, contemplative time when the pressures of the day had ended and the demands of the coming day hadn't yet begun. A mental space between obligations. The physical sensation of the midnight wake in a medieval chamber must have been distinctive. You'd emerge from the warmth of your curtained bed enclosure into the cold air of the chamber. That temperature shock alone would fully wake you. The room would be dark, except possibly for the dim glow of banked fire embers. Every sound would be amplified in the silent wind outside. Occasional stone creaking as temperature changes caused minimal structural shifts, perhaps other household members moving about their own midnight activities. If you needed to urinate, and after 3 or 4 hours of sleep, you probably did, you had options depending on your status and setup. Chamber pots were standard, kept under the bed or nearby, allowing you to relieve yourself without leaving the room. For men, sometimes a simple vessel or bottle sufficed. The contents would be dealt with by servants in the morning, emptied into the garderobes or other waste management systems. Actually venturing to a garderobe, the castle's latrine often positioned in an exterior wall, with a chute dropping waste outside during the midnight wake, would require significant commitment. You'd have to fully dress, or at least wrap yourself in heavy robes, take a candle or lamp, navigate cold stone corridors and return. Most people avoided this, using chamber pots instead, but sometimes you had no choice. Digestive issues, illness, urgent needs. These demanded the trek to the garderobe regardless of hour or weather. This was genuinely miserable in winter. The garderobe openings were deliberately positioned to catch wind, which helped with ventilation but also meant they were freezing. Sitting on a cold stone seat with wind howling up through the chute from below was an experience that combined discomfort with genuine risk if you were elderly or ill. Checking on children was another midnight wake activity. If you had young children sleeping in your chamber or nearby, the wake period was when you'd verify they were warm enough, still breathing, not tangled in blankets in dangerous ways. Infant mortality was high, and parental vigilance during these midnight checks possibly saved lives by catching problems before they became fatal. Servants might use their midnight wake to check on fires throughout the castle, to verify that gates were still secure to listen for problems. There was an informal watch system in many households where different people had understood responsibilities during the night hours, and the midnight wake period was when these checks happened. The transition back to second sleep was usually smooth. You'd finished whatever activity occupied the wake period, prayer conversation, fire tending, whatever, and you'd return to the bed, slip back between the warmed curtains and settle into the still warm blankets. Your body, satisfied that everything was managed, would release you back into sleep within minutes. Second sleep was often deeper and more dream-filled than first sleep. Many medieval accounts of dreams and visions specify they occurred during the second sleep period. There's some modern sleep science suggesting that this might be accurate. The second sleep period in a segmented pattern shows different REM characteristics than consolidated sleep. You'd wake from second sleep naturally as dawn approached around 6 or 7 in the morning, depending on season. The household would begin stirring, servants would be moving about, the castle would transition from night to day. But right now you're approaching the end of your first sleep. You've been unconscious for 3, maybe 4 hours, and your body's preparing to bring you back to wakefulness for that midnight interval. You'll feel it happening, the gradual lightening of sleep, the increasing awareness of the cold air beyond your blanket cocoon, the pressure in your bladder, the vague sense that it's time to surface. This is normal. This is expected. You're not failing at sleep. You're experiencing sleep the way humans did for thousands of years before electricity convinced us otherwise. The midnight wake is coming, and you'll handle it the way millions of people before you handled it, with quiet acceptance, practical actions, and the knowledge that second sleep waits on the other side. Let's be brutally honest about something that medieval families didn't discuss openly, but lived with constantly. Not everyone made it through winter nights. The very young and the very old died in their sleep with horrifying regularity, and the cold was often the silent killer. Understanding this changes how you see every sleeping arrangement, every blanket placement, every decision about who sleeps where. Infants were terrifyingly vulnerable. A newborn can't regulate body temperature effectively. This is basic human physiology that hasn't changed in millennia. Put an infant in a cold room without adequate warmth, and their core temperature drops. Once it drops below a critical threshold, they simply stop breathing. No drama, no warning signs necessarily. They go from sleeping to not breathing, and in the morning you discover you've lost a child. Medieval people knew this. They didn't understand the precise physiological mechanisms, but they absolutely understood through bitter experience that babies died in the cold. So infant sleeping arrangements were calculated with desperate precision. The safest place for an infant was directly against an adult body, sharing body heat continuously through the night. Mother and infant sleeping together was standard across all economic classes. The baby would be positioned between the mother's body and the wall, or between mother and father if both were present, creating a warm pocket protected on multiple sides. But this created a different danger overlaying, an exhausted adult rolling over onto an infant in the night, suffocating the child accidentally. This happened. It happened enough that church authorities issued warnings about it, that coroner's reports documented it, that it shows up in medieval medical and legal texts as a recognized form of accidental death. Some areas developed rules attempting to prevent overlaying requirements that infants sleep in separate cradles next to the bed, rather than in the bed itself. But cradles, unless positioned very carefully and insulated heavily, could be too cold. You were choosing between the risk of suffocation and the risk of hypothermia. Neither option was safe. Wealthy families sometimes had wet nurses who slept with infants, separating the baby from parents, but maintaining the critical body heat sharing. The wet nurse's entire job was infant survival, so theoretically she'd be more vigilant about not rolling onto the child. Theoretically, it still happened. Swaddling wrapping infants tightly in layers of linen and wool served multiple purposes. It was believed to help limbs grow straight, which was nonsense. But it also created insulation, trapping the infant's body heat. A well-swaddled baby maintained temperature better than an unwrapped one. The trade-off was restriction of movement, but in a culture where infant mortality was devastatingly high, warmth trumped mobility. Cradles designed for winter use sometimes had hoods or covers, creating an enclosed space, essentially a fabric tent over the sleeping baby. This trapped warm air around the infant. Some cradles were positioned very close to fires, close enough that modern safety standards would consider it insane, but medieval parents calculated that the burn risk was lower than the freezing risk. Older children fared better than infants, but were still vulnerable. A 5-year-old has better temperature regulation than a newborn, but is still less efficient than an adult. Children sleeping alone in cold rooms were at risk. Children sleeping together 2 or 3 to a bed had much better survival odds through shared body heat. This is why sibling bed sharing was nearly universal. It wasn't about affection or limited space, though those factored in. It was about survival. 3 children in one bed meant 3 small furnaces combining their heat output. 3 children in separate beds meant 3 vulnerable individuals fighting cold alone. Birth order and age created implicit hierarchies in shared children's beds. The youngest, most vulnerable child got the centre position. Older, hardier children took the edges. This wasn't formally stated, it was just understood household logic that preserved the weakest members. The elderly faced different but equally serious risks. Aging diminishes the body's ability to generate and retain heat. Circulation becomes less efficient. Fat stores that provide insulation decrease. An 80-year-old in a cold room is fighting a losing battle against thermodynamics. Elderly family members were given preferential sleeping positions for exactly this reason. They might sleep in the warmest chamber closest to any heat source with the heaviest blankets and furs. This wasn't just respect for age, it was practical survival management. Lose your elderly family members, and you lose accumulated wisdom, household management skills, childcare support, everything that made extended families functional economic units. Grandparents sleeping with grandchildren was common and served dual purposes. The children benefited from adult body heat. The elderly person benefited from the children's collective warmth, and the implicit monitoring kids would notice if grandma stopped breathing and raise an alarm. The sick presented agonizing calculations. Illness already stressed the body's systems. Add cold exposure and mortality risks skyrocketed. Sick individuals needed maximum warmth, which meant best sleeping positions, most blankets possibly even being moved to the warmest available space regardless of normal household hierarchies. But infectious illness created a counter-pressure. If someone had a fever or contagious disease, do you still bed them with others for warmth? Do you risk spreading infection to preserve body heat? Medieval households had to make these choices constantly, and there were no good answers. Servants often got the worst sleeping arrangements, coldest rooms, fewest blankets, least access to heat sources. This was partly about status hierarchy, but it also reflected brutal economic logic. A noble family had more invested in their own children's survival than in servants who could theoretically be replaced. Servant mortality in winter was higher than household family mortality, and everyone knew it. Some households provided better conditions for valued servants, those with specific skills, long tenure, or personal loyalty. A master craftsman or trusted household manager might be given sleeping arrangements nearly as good as minor family members. Unskilled labour got the minimum necessary for survival, if that. The seasonal death rate spike in late winter was recognised and expected. February and March, when fuel supplies were lowest, and the cold had been grinding away at people for months, saw the highest mortality among vulnerable populations. Families would sometimes make it through December and January only to lose members in the final brutal weeks of winter. You're lying in your bed now, warm enough under your layers of blankets, secure in the knowledge that you healthy adult, properly provisioned, will almost certainly survive this night. But elsewhere in this castle, other calculations are happening. A mother is checking her infant's breathing for the 3rd time tonight. An elderly man is pulling blankets tighter, feeling cold in his bones that no amount of fabric seems to touch. Children are pressed together in shared beds, unconsciously seeking each other's warmth. And come morning, maybe everyone wakes up. Maybe the household count is the same as it was at sunset. But maybe it isn't. Maybe someone's breathing just got shallower and shallower through the night and the cold won. Medieval people didn't talk about this openly, but they lived with it constantly. Every winter night was a small battle. Most nights most people won, but not all nights, and not all people. The cold was patient, and it always got some of them. The position of your bed in this chamber isn't random. Every foot of distance from walls, every inch of elevation, every degree of orientation relative to the fireplace and windows, all of it was calculated based on centuries of accumulated experience about thermal survival. Where your bed sits represents the optimal compromise between dozens of competing factors, each of which could mean the difference between miserable and tolerable sleep. First principle distance from exterior walls. Your bed is positioned at least 3 feet from any exterior stone wall, possibly more, This isn't wasted space, this is a thermal buffer zone. Remember, those walls radiate cold inward. The closer you sleep to them, the more that radiant cold affects you directly. Even with tapestries creating air gaps, the wall influence extends several feet into the room. 3 feet of separation means the coldest air, the layer directly chilled by wall proximity, settles in that gap rather than around your sleeping body. It's a dead zone, a sacrifice space that absorbs the worst of the wall's thermal aggression, so you don't have to. Interior walls are less hostile but still not ideal sleeping positions. They're warmer than exterior walls because they're not exposed to outside temperatures, but they're still stone, still massive thermal sinks. Your bed positions itself away from all walls when possible, creating circulation space that allows whatever warm air exists in the room to move around the bed rather than being trapped against cold surfaces. Height off the floor we've discussed, but it bears repeating with more precision. Your sleeping platform sits approximately 3 feet above the stone floor. Not 2 feet that's too low still in the densest cold air layer. Not 4 feet that's unnecessarily high, creates access problems, and doesn't provide proportional thermal benefit. 3 feet is the sweet spot validated by centuries of trial and error. The bed frame's mass matters too. Those heavy oak posts aren't just structural, they're also thermal mass that absorbs and holds some of the warmth from your bed's microclimate. During the night, as your body heat accumulates inside the curtained enclosure, the wooden frame warms slightly. That warmth radiates back toward you, creating a feedback loop. It's marginal, but marginal gains accumulate. Orientation relative to the fireplace is critical. Your bed is positioned so that when you're lying down, your body axis head to feet is roughly parallel to a line drawn from the fireplace. Not perpendicular, which would expose one side of your body to radiant heat, while the other side received nothing. Parallel positioning allows more even distribution of whatever minimal radiant warmth reaches the bed, but you're also not too close to the fireplace. 10 to 12 feet is typical. Closer, and you'd get excessive heat on one side, creating uncomfortable temperature differentials. You'd roast on the fireplace side while freezing on the far side. Further away, and you'd get almost no benefit from the fire at all. That 10 to 12 foot distance represents the outer edge of the fireplace's useful heating radius. The relationship to windows is equally calculated. Your bed is positioned so that no window is directly above or beside your sleeping platform. Windows leak cold air even when shuttered. Having one directly adjacent to your bed would create a constant cold draft washing over you all night. Unacceptable. Ideally, the bed is positioned with windows behind the head or foot still in the room, providing necessary daylight when opened but not directing their thermal liability directly onto your sleeping body. The bed curtains create additional barriers between window drafts and your actual sleeping space. If the chamber has multiple windows, the bed positioning represents a compromise, maximizing distance from the worst windows, north-facing largest openings while accepting proximity to less problematic ones, smaller south-facing. Door positioning matters enormously. Your bed is never directly in line with the door. Doors leak air through gaps and around frames. When someone opens the door, servants entering, household members passing through, cold air from the corridor rushes in. If your bed is directly aligned with the door, that cold influx hits you immediately. Instead, the bed is positioned to the side, often at an angle so that the door opens into the room, but the incoming air has to travel and mix before reaching your sleeping location. This gives the cold air time to rise and dissipate slightly, rather than hitting you as a concentrated blast. There's also a privacy consideration. Medieval doors often didn't have locks, or if they did, locks were simple and not entirely secure. Positioning your bed so it's not immediately visible from the doorway provided some minimal privacy. Someone opening the door wouldn't have an instant direct view of you sleeping. Some beds were positioned in alcoves or recesses in the chamber walls. These weren't separate rooms, just architectural indentations that created 3-sided enclosures. Positioning the bed in an alcove meant you had solid walls on 3 sides, reducing the directions from which cold could attack. The trade-off was less circulation and potentially more concentrated cold from those surrounding walls, but in some chamber layouts, alcove positioning was the best available option. Ceiling height variations mattered in multi-level chambers. If your room had sections with different ceiling heights common in castle architecture, with partial mezzanines or lowered ceiling sections, you'd position the bed in the lower ceiling area. Less vertical space meant less volume to heat, and less distance for your body heat to rise uselessly before being trapped by the canopy. The bed's relationship to traffic patterns through the chamber was considered. If your room served as a passage between other spaces, servants moving through household members crossing to reach other areas the bed was positioned to minimize disturbance. You didn't want people walking past the bed constantly creating air movement that disrupted the thermal stability you were trying to maintain. Some chambers had multiple hearths or brazier positions. In those cases, bed positioning tried to balance benefit from multiple heat sources. You couldn't be equally close to all of them, but you could position yourself to receive some radiant benefit from multiple directions, creating a more even thermal environment. Historians still argue about whether bed positioning followed formal architectural rules or evolved through practical experience in each specific chamber. Probably both. Master masons and household architects understood these principles and designed chambers with optimal bed positioning in mind. But individual households also experimented moving beds over years to find the configuration that worked best for their specific space. There's evidence from household inventories of beds being repositioned seasonally. Summer positioning might favour better air circulation and distance from heat sources. Winter positioning prioritised maximum thermal benefit, accepting reduced circulation in exchange for better warmth retention. Your bed sits where it sits right now because generations of people sleeping in this chamber figured out through cold experience that this position, this specific location on the floor plan, offered the best compromise between all the competing thermal factors. It's not perfect, no position in a medieval stone chamber is perfect, but it's optimal given the constraints. You're lying in accumulated wisdom. The exact distance from that wall, the precise orientation to that fireplace, the calculated clearance from that window. All of it represents the collective learning of everyone who slept here before you and survived to refine the positioning. And tonight you benefit from their cold-won knowledge. Now we need to address the extremities, your fingers, your toes, your nose, your ears, because these are the parts of your body that are actively trying to betray you to the cold. Even with all your preparations even sealed inside your curtained bed under 20 pounds of blankets, your extremities are thermal liability zones that require specific constant management. The physics is straightforward and cruel. Extremities have high surface area to volume ratios, meaning they lose heat faster than your core. Your fingers and toes are essentially radiators shedding warmth into the environment with terrible efficiency. Your body knows this and responds by restricting blood flow to extremities when core temperature is threatened, prioritizing survival of vital organs over the comfort of your fingers. This is why your toes go numb first. It's not random, it's your cardiovascular system making calculated sacrifices. Those toes aren't essential for immediate survival, so blood flow gets throttled, temperature drops, and you lose sensation. If the cold continues, you progress from numbness to pain to actual tissue damage. Chilblains, frostbite, gangrene. These weren't abstract medical terms in medieval life. These were real risks from sleeping in inadequately warmed conditions. Your feet are wrapped in wool hose, as we discussed, but wool alone isn't always sufficient. Some people slept with their feet wrapped in additional fabric rags, old linen strips, whatever was available, creating extra insulation layers. Others tucked their feet into the fur coverlet if they had one, creating a pocket where foot warmth could accumulate. The strategic use of hot stones came into play specifically for feet. Remember those wrapped hot stones placed in the bed during pre-warming? Those were positioned at the foot of the bed deliberately. You'd arrange your feet against or near the wrapped stone, and for the first few hours of sleep you'd have external heat supplementing your body's efforts to keep extremities warm. As the stone cooled through the night, and it would cool eventually, radiating away all its stored heat, you'd adapt. Tuck your feet up toward your body, curling into a more compact position. Draw your knees up, make yourself smaller, reduce the extremity exposure. Medieval sleeping positions were often semi-fetal, not because it was comfortable, but because it was thermally efficient. Hands were equally problematic. Even under blankets, hands exposed to air would chill rapidly. The solution was keeping them close to your core. Hands tucked under your body, pressed against your stomach or chest where your core heat was strongest. Some people slept with hands tucked into armpits, awkward but effective. The blood flowing through your torso would warm your hands continuously as long as you maintained contact. Sleeping mittens existed but were uncommon. They were usually fingerless, allowing some manual dexterity if you needed to adjust blankets or deal with a candle during the midnight wake. Full mittens were too restrictive. You couldn't manipulate anything while wearing them, but fingerless mittens kept the bulk of your hand warm while leaving fingertips exposed for necessary tasks. Your nose was a particular problem because it protruded from your face, exposed to air, regardless of how deeply you burrowed into blankets. and unlike hands and feet, you couldn't really insulate your nose without suffocating yourself. You needed to breathe, which meant your nose stayed exposed to the cold chamber air. The solution was partial. Bury your face partially in blankets or pillows, creating a warm air pocket around your nose and mouth. You'd breathe that same air repeatedly, warming it with each exhalation, so subsequent inhalations were less shockingly cold. This created a humid, somewhat stale breathing environment, but it was warmer than breathing fresh cold air directly. The trade-off was comfort versus oxygen. Bury your face too deeply, and you'd wake up feeling stuffy, possibly with a headache from rebreathing too much CO2. Leave it too exposed and your nose would be painfully cold all night. You'd adjust repeatedly during the night, finding the balance point between warmth and breathability. Ears were vulnerable, which is partly why nightcaps were pulled down to cover them completely. Ears have essentially no insulating fat, lots of surface area, and frostbite of the ear cartilage was a real concern in the coldest conditions. A nightcap wasn't optional, it was essential extremity protection. Some people slept with scarves or additional fabric wrapped around their heads and necks, creating layers of insulation for the entire head region. You'd look absurd by modern standards, essentially mummified in fabric, but you'd be measurably warmer. Function over form always. The bed partner's body became a heat source for extremity warming. If you shared the bed with a spouse or child, you'd strategically position cold feet against their legs or back, using their body heat to warm your extremities. This was accepted part of the mutual survival pact of bed sharing. You'd do the same for them when their feet got cold. Children learned early to tuck their hands under their bodies or into their sleeping shifts rather than leaving them exposed. Parents taught this specifically, understanding that cold extremities disrupted sleep and could progress to actual injury. Proper sleeping position was a survival skill passed down through demonstration and correction. The morning assessment of extremities was routine. You'd wake up and immediately check, can I feel my toes? Are my fingers responsive? Does my nose hurt? Any tingling or numbness that didn't resolve quickly was concerning. Repeated cold exposure to extremities caused cumulative damage. Medieval people who survived many winters often had permanent sensitivity to cold in fingers and toes from years of marginal circulation. Chilblains, painful inflammation of small blood vessels in response to repeated cold exposure were endemic in winter. Your fingers or toes would itch, intensely swell, sometimes develop painful lesions. There was no effective treatment. You just endured it and tried to prevent worsening by better extremity protection in subsequent nights. Frostbite was less common in sleeping conditions because you'd usually wake up before tissue damage became severe, the pain would rouse you. But it happened particularly to people who were ill, elderly or intoxicated. You'd fall asleep, fail to wake when extremities got dangerously cold, and wake in the morning with black and dead tissue on fingers or toes. Medieval medical texts have remedies for cold-damaged extremities, warming them gradually, not rapidly, which caused additional damage, applying various poultices, sometimes even amputation if gangrene developed. The fact that these remedies existed in standard medical references tells you how common the problem was. You're lying in your bed now, and you can feel your toes starting to cool despite the wool hose and the blankets and all your preparations. It's subtle at first, just a slight awareness that they're not as warm as your core. You flex them, wiggle them, trying to maintain circulation. You consider tucking them up closer to your body, but that changes your sleeping position uncomfortably. This is the eternal negotiation of medieval sleep: comfort versus warmth, relaxation versus thermal management. You're never fully settled, never completely at ease. You're always monitoring, adjusting, repositioning, managing your body's relationship to the cold that's constantly probing for weaknesses. Your extremities are the front line in this nightly battle, and they require constant vigilant defense. Before you even climbed into bed tonight, before you put on your sleeping shift and nightcap, you ate something. This wasn't casual dining, this was fuel loading, the deliberate consumption of specific foods chosen for their ability to generate internal heat that would sustain you through the frozen hours ahead. Medieval people understood, perhaps better than we do, that your body is a furnace, and furnaces need fuel to maintain their burn. The evening meal, supper, taken sometime in the late afternoon or early evening, depending on season and household schedule, was strategically timed and composed. You wanted to eat early enough that digestion was well underway before sleep, but late enough that the metabolic heat from digestion would carry into the night. 3 or 4 hours before bed was typical, allowing your stomach to process the meal, while you remained active, then transitioning into sleep with metabolism still elevated. The foods themselves followed specific logic. You wanted dense, slow-burning calories that would release energy gradually over hours, rather than spiking and crashing quickly. Pottage-thick vegetable and grain stews was the foundational meal across all economic classes for exactly this reason. Barley peas, beans, root vegetables all simmered together into a heavy filling mass that sat in your stomach and digested slowly. Wealthy households added meat to their pottage, pork, mutton, whatever was available, which increased both caloric density and the thermal effect of digestion. Protein requires more energy to break down than carbohydrates, generating more metabolic heat in the process. A chunk of fatty pork in your evening stew meant your body would be working harder, burning hotter for hours after eating. Fat was particularly valued for winter eating and not just for the calories. Fat is metabolically expensive to process and generates substantial heat. The layer of grease floating on top of your stew wasn't a sign of poor cooking. It was intentional fuel. You'd soak bread in it, consume it deliberately, knowing that fat would keep your internal furnace burning longer than lean protein or simple carbohydrates. Bread itself was a staple, but winter bread was often darker, denser, made from whole grains rather than refined flour. This wasn't just about economics. Whole grain bread digested more slowly, providing sustained energy release rather than quick sugar spikes. A chunk of heavy rye or barley bread with your supper meant hours of steady metabolic activity. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, carrots were winter staples partly because they stored well, but also because they provided solid, fibrous calories that took time to digest. Your body would be working on that turnip for hours, generating heat as a byproduct of digestion. Onions and garlic appeared in almost everything, and while medieval people attributed warming properties to them based on humoral theory, there's actually some metabolic truth there. Alliums do have compounds that stimulate circulation slightly. Whether the effect was significant enough to measurably impact body temperature is debatable, but the perception of warmth was real enough. The evening drink was often ale, small beer, low alcohol, consumed in quantity. Ale provided calories in liquid form, easy to consume even when you weren't particularly hungry. The mild alcohol content created a slight vasodilation effect, a feeling of warmth spreading through your body. This was somewhat illusory. Alcohol actually increases heat loss, overall, by bringing warm blood to the skin surface, but the immediate sensation was warming, and that psychological effect mattered. For the wealthy, wine supplemented or replaced ale. Red wine ideally, which was considered hotter in the humoral system than white. Whether or not the medical theory was accurate, red wine does contain more phenolic compounds that create a warming sensation in the mouth and throat, contributing to the perception of internal heat. The timing of drinking mattered. Consuming too much liquid too close to bedtime meant waking multiple times to urinate, which disrupted sleep, and required leaving the warm bed to use the chamber pot or garderobe. So you'd drink with your meal, then taper off in the final hour before bed, balancing hydration against the inconvenience of midnight bathroom trips. Some households served a specific pre-sleep snack, an hour or so before bed, not a full meal, but something small and warming. Bread soaked in warm ale or wine. A small portion of pottage reserved from supper and reheated. Perhaps some cheese, which was dense with fat and protein. The goal was to give your metabolism one final boost right before sleep, ensuring you'd have fuel burning through at least the first sleep period. Honey appeared in pre-sleep preparations when available. A spoonful of honey in warm ale or wine or spread on bread provided fast-burning sugars that would spike your metabolism initially, plus the psychological comfort of sweetness. Honey was expensive, but even small amounts were valued for their warming effect. Spices in pre-sleep drinks and foods weren't just flavoring. Ginger, cinnamon, cloves, pepper all were classified as hot in medieval medical theory and were believed to increase internal warmth. Modern science recognizes that some spices do increase metabolic rates slightly and improve circulation. Whether the effect was significant or mostly placebo didn't matter. The warmth people felt after consuming spiced drinks was real to them. Mulled wine or ale specifically for sleep preparation appeared in wealthier households. Wine heated with spices, honey if available, sometimes with bread soaked in it, until it became a semi-solid mass. This was calorically dense warming both from temperature and metabolic processing, and had the added benefit of mild sedative effects from the alcohol. The poor couldn't afford elaborate spiced drinks, but they understood the same principles. Warm any liquid, add whatever calories you could afford, a bit of lard, some oats, whatever, and consume it before bed. The warmth going down felt good, and the calories provided fuel even if the meal was barely adequate by any standard. Children received particular attention to pre-sleep feeding. A child with an empty stomach would burn through available calories quickly and wake cold and hungry in the middle of the night. So children got extra portions at supper, extra snacks before bed, ensuring they had maximum fuel for their smaller, less efficient bodies. The elderly needed similar consideration, but often had reduced appetites. Encouraging an elderly family member to eat adequately before bed was a household concern. Warm, easy-to-digest foods that didn't require much chewing, soft bread, thin pottage, warm milk if available, helped ensure they consumed enough calories to sustain them through the night. There was an understanding, imperfect but real, that different people needed different amounts of fuel. A large man doing physical labour needed more pre-sleep calories than a small woman with a sedentary role. Children needed proportionally more for their size because their bodies burned fuel less efficiently. Pregnant and nursing women needed extra. The household food distribution reflected these variations when resources allowed. Starvation and cold were a deadly combination. If you were already malnourished, your body had no reserves to burn for warmth. This is why late winter was so dangerous by February, and March food stores were running low. People were subsisting on reduced rations and their ability to generate body heat was compromised. The cold killed people who might have survived with adequate nutrition. You've eaten tonight. Your supper was substantial pottage with some meat bread ale, maybe a late snack of cheese and more bread. Your stomach is comfortably full, and you can feel your metabolism working, generating that internal warmth that's as important as all your blankets combined. Your body is a furnace and you've fed it well. Now, it'll burn through the night, keeping your core temperature stable while you sleep. The fuel is loaded, the fire is lit, and the long, cold night can do its worst. Your internal heat will hold the line. Now we arrive at the drinks that weren't just about calories, the specific heated beverages consumed in the final hour before sleep preparations that combined warmth, mild sedation, and cultural ritual into something that was part medicine, part comfort, part survival strategy. These weren't casual drinks. These were deliberate interventions in your body's chemistry, designed to ease the transition from wakefulness to sleep in a freezing environment. Mulled wine was the aristocratic standard when you could afford it. The preparation was specific red wine heated in a metal pot over the fire, but not boiled. Boiling would cook off the alcohol and was considered to damage the wine's essential properties. You wanted it hot enough to steam hot enough that holding the cup required care, but not boiling. The spices added weren't random. Cinnamon was considered warming and soporific. Cloves were believed to aid digestion and settle the stomach. Ginger stimulated circulation, bringing warmth to extremities. Nutmeg in small amounts was thought to promote sleep, and in larger amounts actually has mild psychoactive properties that medieval people may have recognized empirically without understanding the chemistry. Some recipes included honey for sweetness and additional calories. Others added a small amount of bread soaked in the hot wine until it dissolved into a thick porridge-like consistency. This transformed the drink into something between beverage and food, providing both liquid warmth and solid calories. The ritual of drinking mulled wine was as important as the beverage itself. You'd sit near the fire if you had one cup in both hands, feeling the warmth transfer through the ceramic or wood into your palms. The steam rising would warm your face. The first sip would burn slightly, going down a controlled heat spreading through your chest. Then you'd feel the vasodilation, blood vessels expanding slightly from the heat, and the alcohol creating that flush of warmth spreading from your core outward. This was temporary and somewhat illusory, but in the moment it felt wonderful. Your fingers would tingle slightly. Your toes would feel warmer. The cold chamber would seem less hostile for those few minutes. The alcohol content was important, but not overwhelming. Medieval wine was generally lower in alcohol than modern wine, and you weren't drinking to get drunk. You were drinking enough to take the edge off anxiety and cold, to ease your body into relaxation. 1 cup, maybe 2 if the night was particularly brutal, not the consumption levels associated with feasting or celebration. Mulled ale was the more common alternative for those who couldn't afford wine or preferred it. Ale heated with a hot poker, an iron rod left in the fire until glowing, then plunged into the ale, would hiss and foam, dramatically partially from the temperature shock and partially from the iron reacting with compounds in the ale. This created a slightly caramelized flavour and made the ale genuinely hot. Spices could be added to ale just as to wine, though the flavour profile was different. Ale spicing tended toward more bitter herbal notes, wormwood, yarrow, mugwort herbs that were believed to promote sleep and ward off nightmares. Whether these herbs had actual sedative effects or worked through placebo and ritual, people reported sleeping better after consuming them. Some ale preparations included egg. A raw egg, beaten into hot ale, created a richer, more substantial drink. The egg provided protein and fat additional calories to fuel your body through the night. The texture was thick, almost custard-like when done properly, coating your throat and stomach with warmth. Milk-based drinks appeared less frequently. Milk was valuable, especially in winter when dairy production dropped. But when available, warm milk with honey and spices was given to children, the elderly and the sick. Milk has tryptophan, which genuinely does promote sleep, though medieval people didn't know the biochemistry. They just knew experientially that warm milk helped people sleep. The temperature of these drinks was carefully managed. Too hot and you'd burn your mouth, which was genuinely dangerous. A burned mouth could become infected and infection could kill you. But too cool and you lost the therapeutic warmth. The ideal was hot enough that you had to sip carefully, allowing the liquid to cool slightly in your mouth before swallowing, but still hot when it reached your stomach. The cup itself mattered. Ceramic or wooden cups held heat better than metal, which conducted warmth away too quickly. You'd wrap both hands around the cup, using it as a hand warmer while you drank. The physical act of holding something warm was psychologically comforting beyond just the temperature transfer. Drinking posture was deliberate. You sat rather than stood, conserving energy. Often you'd be wrapped in your sleeping robes or daytime clothes already partially prepared for bed. The transition from waking activity to sleep preparation was gradual, and the warm drink marked a specific point in that transition, the moment when you shifted from active to passive, from working to resting. Conversation during drinking was quieter, more reflective than daytime talk. If you shared this ritual with family or household members, the topic shifted away from practical concerns toward more contemplative subjects. Prayers were sometimes recited, stories might be told, but often people just drank in companionable silence, watching the fire, feeling the warmth spread through their bodies. The timing was calculated. Drink too early, and the warming effect would fade before you got into bed. Too late, and you'd be fighting sleep while trying to finish, and you'd go to bed with a full bladder that would wake you inconveniently soon. 30 to 60 minutes before bed was ideal enough time for the drink's effects to fully manifest, but close enough to bedtime that the warmth carried you into sleep. There was a medical dimension that medieval people took seriously. These drinks were considered preventative medicine, maintaining health rather than treating illness. The theory of humour suggested that cold and damp were disease-causing qualities, and hot spiced drinks countered those qualities, keeping your body in healthy balance. Whether the theory was accurate, the practice of consuming warm caloric beverages before sleeping in cold conditions was genuinely health-promoting. Some preparations included medicinal herbs beyond just spices: chamomile for its calming effects, valerian root for deeper sleep, linden flowers for relaxation. These weren't random folk remedies. Many of these plants have compounds that genuinely affect nervous system function, and medieval herbalists had identified them through centuries of experimentation. The wealthy had servants who prepared these drinks, bringing them at the appropriate time in cups warmed by the fire. The poor prepared their own with simpler ingredients, but the same underlying principle. Something hot, something with calories, something that would help ease the transition from the active cold of evening into the passive cold of night. Historians still argue about how universal these pre-sleep drinking rituals were, versus how much they were privileges of the wealthy. Certainly not everyone had access to spiced wine or even ale every night. But even the poorest household that could manage it would heat water, add whatever they had, herbs from the garden, a bit of honey, if they'd been able to trade for it even just hot water by itself, and drink something warm before bed. You're holding your cup now, feeling the warmth in your palms. The spiced wine or ale or whatever you've managed tonight is steaming slightly. You can smell cinnamon cloves, that distinctive medieval scent of heated alcohol and spices. The first sip burns pleasantly, warmth spreading through your chest. You're preparing your body for sleep the way humans have done for centuries, not with pills or technology, but with heat and herbs and ritual. Your metabolism is spiking slightly from the alcohol and spices. Your muscles are relaxing. Your anxiety about the cold night ahead is softening into drowsy acceptance. The cup empties slowly. You're in no rush. This is transition time, the bridge between day and night. And the warm drink in your hands is the vehicle carrying you across. Before you finally surrender to sleep, there's one more ritual that matters more than any physical preparation. The prayers, the invocations, the whispered words into the darkness that served as both spiritual practice and psychological insulation against the very real terror of night. Because medieval sleep wasn't just about managing cold, it was about managing fear and faith was the primary technology for that. Night was dangerous in ways modern people struggle to understand. Darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it was the presence of threat. The hours between sunset and sunrise were when demons walked, when illness struck, when death came quietly to steal breath from sleeping bodies. You went to sleep never entirely certain you'd wake up, and that uncertainty required management. Prayer was that management system. The evening prayers, compline in the monastic schedule, but adapted for lay household use, marked the formal transition from day to night. You'd kneel beside your bed, sometimes alone, often with family members or household members present, and recite the familiar words that millions of other Christians were reciting at the same moment across Europe. The Lord's Prayer was universal. Everyone knew it, from the highest noble to the poorest peasant. Pater noster qui es in caelis. The Latin rolled out almost automatically the words, so familiar that conscious thought wasn't required. That familiarity was the point prayer as ritual rather than spontaneous expression, creating a psychological transition through repetitive structured language. The Ave Maria followed. Ave Maria gratia plena, asking Mary's intercession, her protection through the vulnerable hours of sleep. Mary as mother figure watching over you as a human mother would watch over a sleeping child. The imagery was deliberate and comforting. Then the more specific night prayers that address sleep and darkness directly. In manus tuas, Domine, commendo spiritum meum, into your hands, Lord, I commend my spirit. This was the prayer Christ spoke on the cross, and speaking it before sleep created a parallel. You were surrendering consciousness, giving up control, trusting that you'd be returned to waking life in the morning. Some households had elaborate evening prayer sequences that could last 15 or 20 minutes. Prayers for protection from fire, from thieves, from demons, from illness, from sudden death. Each threat acknowledged, each fear named and offered up for divine protection. This wasn't paranoia, these were real risks that killed people regularly. The prayers weren't just words, they were actions that created psychological armor. By naming your fears in a structured religious framework, you transformed them from overwhelming chaos into manageable concerns that had been properly submitted to higher authority. You'd done what you could. The rest was God's will. Children were taught evening prayers from the earliest age they could speak. Simple versions at first, short appeals to God and Mary for protection, then gradually more elaborate as they matured. Teaching children to pray before sleep was teaching them the fundamental technology of managing fear and uncertainty that they'd need throughout their lives. The physical posture of prayer mattered. Kneeling beside the bed, hands clasped, head bowed, this was embodied submission and vulnerability. You made yourself small, acknowledged your weakness, positioned yourself as supplicant before power greater than yourself. The cold stone floor against your knees was part of it, a physical discomfort that demonstrated the seriousness of your petition. Some people prayed inside the bed, already under the covers, too cold or too ill to kneel. This was acceptable, though considered less ideal. The Church recognized that physical weakness sometimes overrode formal requirements. Better to pray lying down than not to pray at all. There were prayers for specific intentions. If someone in the household was ill, you'd pray for their recovery. If winter had been particularly harsh, you'd pray for spring. If family members were travelling, you'd pray for their safe return. The prayer structure accommodated personal concerns within the larger framework of nightly devotion. Saints were invoked for particular protections, St. Christopher for travellers, St. Agatha for protection from fire, St. Apollonia for tooth pain. The whole communion of saints became a celestial support network, specialists you could petition for specific needs. Prayers before sleep often included several saint invocations covering multiple potential threats. Blessings were exchanged between family members. Parents blessed children. Spouses blessed each other. May God keep you through the night, or similar phrases creating a web of mutual spiritual protection. These weren't empty formalities, they were genuine expressions of care, acknowledging that the person you were blessing might not survive until morning. Some households had holy water stored in small vessels near beds. You'd cross yourself with it before sleep, the water blessed by a priest carrying divine protection through physical medium. The touch of cold water on forehead, chest, shoulders, a bodily reminder of baptism and belonging to the Christian community. Relics. If the household possessed any, were touched or kissed before sleep. A fragment of saint's bone in a reliquary, a piece of cloth that had touched a holy site, whatever the family had managed to acquire. These physical objects served as connection points to divine power. tangible things you could touch when abstract faith felt insufficient. Crucifixes hung on walls or were held in hand during prayers. The image of Christ suffering on the cross provided both comfort. You weren't suffering alone, Christ had suffered more. An intercession, Christ as mediator between you and God. Looking at the crucifix while praying focused your attention and reinforced the theological framework that made sense of suffering. The prayers acknowledged mortality directly. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. This familiar children's prayer has medieval origins and it's shockingly blunt. You might die tonight. This is possible. Here's what should happen to your soul if you do. No euphemism, no avoidance, just practical spiritual planning. Confession of sins was part of evening prayer for many people. A quick mental review of the day's failures, acknowledgement of wrongs done or good left undone, asking forgiveness. This wasn't formal confession to a priest that happened less frequently, but a personal accounting before sleep. You didn't want to die with unconfessed sin weighing on your soul. The psychological effect of this prayer structure was profound. You'd gone through your day filled with practical concerns, physical discomforts, social tensions, all the normal chaos of medieval life. The evening prayers created a mental shift, moving you out of immediate concerns and into a larger framework where your individual suffering connected to cosmic meaning. You were cold, yes. You were afraid, yes. But you were also part of a vast Christian community protected by saints and angels, loved by a God who had himself experienced human suffering. The prayers reminded you of this, relocated your immediate experience within theological context that made it bearable. Historians still argue about whether medieval people genuinely believed the theological content of these prayers or simply performed them out of social obligation and habit. Probably both, varying by individual. But the psychological function was real, regardless of the depth of theological conviction. The ritual worked even for people who doubted. You're kneeling now beside your bed knees on cold stone hands clasped. The familiar Latin words are flowing from your mouth almost without conscious thought. The candle flickers nearby. The chamber is dark beyond its small circle of light. Outside, wind tests the shutters. Somewhere else in the castle, other voices are murmuring the same prayers. You're afraid, not panic afraid, just the low-grade fear that comes from knowing you're vulnerable, that the night is long, that many things could go wrong. But the words help. They always help. They create structure, meaning the sense that you've done what you're supposed to do. The prayers finish. You cross yourself one final time. You're ready now, as ready as prayer and ritual can make you. Now comes the final surrender, climbing into bed, pulling the curtains closed, releasing yourself into sleep, and trusting that morning will come. You're climbing into the bed now, the final physical action before sleep. And this isn't a casual movement, it's a deliberate sequence that's been refined through countless cold nights into a specific choreography of thermal preservation. Every motion matters because every motion either conserves warmth or wastes it. And you've learned through shivering experience exactly how this should be done. First you blow out the candle or position it safely where it won't be knocked over and can burn down naturally. Some people leave a candle burning through first sleep, accepting the cost and risk for the psychological comfort of having light available during the midnight wake. Others extinguish everything, surrendering completely to darkness. You've made your choice based on fuel supply, fear levels, and personal preference developed over years. The climb itself requires coordination. The bed is 3 feet high, remember, so you're not simply lying down, you're ascending onto a platform. You place one foot on the wooden step or stool positioned beside the bed, hoist yourself up, and maneuver your body onto the mattress edge. The mattress compresses beneath you with that familiar rustling sound of straw and the softer compression of wool or feathers. You're sitting on the edge now, and this is when you make final adjustments. Check that your nightcap is secure, tied properly under your chin so it won't slip off during sleep. Adjust your sleeping shift so it's not bunched uncomfortably. Make sure your wool hose are pulled up properly, no wrinkles or folds that will create pressure points during the night. If you're sharing the bed, there's a negotiation about positioning, who sleeps where. If there's an infant or small child, they go in the middle between adults. If it's you and a spouse, you've probably established a pattern, one person, preferring the wall side, the other the open side. Maybe you alternate based on who's colder that night or who needs easier access for midnight wake activities. The curtains are still open at this point. You need light and air circulation for these final preparations. You're arranging pillows if you have pillows, and not everyone did positioning them to support your head at the right angle. Too flat and your neck hurts. Too high and you can't breathe comfortably. Medieval pillows were often quite firm, stuffed with straw or wool, not the soft down pillows of later eras, except for the very wealthy. Now comes the layering sequence. You swing your legs up onto the mattress, feeling the residual warmth from the warming pan if it was used, or the neutral coolness if it wasn't. You lie back, adjusting your body position. If there are hot stones at the foot of the bed, you position your feet to benefit from them without direct contact that might be too hot. The bottom sheet is already in place, tucked under the mattress. You're lying on it, feeling the linen against your wool-covered body. Now comes the top sheet pulled up to your chest or neck, depending on personal preference. The sheet creates the first barrier, light but significant. Then the first wool blanket. You reach for it, or a bed partner hands it to you, and pull it up, feeling the weight settle over your body. Already the trapped air between sheet and blanket is beginning to warm from your body heat. You adjust the edges, making sure the blanket is tucked along your sides, eliminating gaps where warm air could escape. Second wool blanket. More weight, more warmth. The pressure on your chest is becoming noticeable now. You're being compressed into the mattress by textile weight. This is normal. This is good. The weight means insulation. If there's a fur coverlet, it comes next. This is substantial, heavy enough that pulling it up requires real effort. The fur side faces down, remember, against the wool. The leather side faces up smooth and cool against your hands as you arrange it. The weight is significant now. You're definitely pinned. Movement will be deliberate, not casual rolling. Finally, the quilted top coverlet if you have one. This is the final layer, the heaviest, the one that seals everything beneath. You pull it up with both hands, let it settle over the entire textile architecture you've constructed. The total weight might be 15, 18, even 20 pounds. You're breathing against resistance. Your body is compressed into the mattress. You're quite literally buried in fabric. Now the crucial step, sealing the edges. You reach down along your sides and tuck the blanket edges under your body, creating an envelope that traps warm air. The bottom of the blankets is already tucked under the mattress foot. The sides are now tucked under your body. The top is pulled up to your chin or just below. You've created a fabric cocoon with minimal openings. If you're bed sharing, there's coordination required. You both have to be positioned and settled before final tucking happens, or someone ends up trapped awkwardly. There's a practiced efficiency to this. Couples who've shared beds for years can do the entire layering and tucking sequence in near darkness without discussion, each person knowing their role. Your arms are the last consideration. Do you keep them outside the blankets or inside outside means easier access if you need to adjust something but cold arms. Inside means warmth but restriction. Most people tuck arms inside hands against the body core, accepting the limitation for the warmth benefit. Now the final action, closing the bed curtains. You reach out from your fabric cocoon, grasp the heavy wool curtain and pull it closed along the side you're responsible for. The curtain overlaps slightly with the adjacent curtain, creating a seal. If you're alone, you have to reach awkwardly to pull all the curtains closed, which is annoying. If you're sharing the bed, each person closes the curtains on their side. The last curtain falls into place. The overlap is checked by feel. You run your hand along the join to make sure there's no gap. And then darkness. Complete darkness. The bed curtains block any residual light from banked fire embers or moonlight through shutter cracks. You're sealed inside a fabric chamber, lying in complete blackness, compressed under 20 pounds of textiles. The silence is distinct. The curtains muffle sound from the room beyond. You can hear your own breathing, your bed partner's breathing if present the rustle of fabric when anyone moves. But the room sounds windfire, distant household noises are muted, distant, separated from you by layers of wool. The temperature inside your curtained enclosure is already noticeably different from when you started. Your body heat is accumulating in the trapped air. The blankets are warming from your body temperature. The cold that dominated the room before is being held at bay by fabric barriers. You're motionless now, letting your body settle, letting the warmth build. You can feel your toes beginning to warm, not quickly but gradually. Your fingers tucked against your torso are warming faster. Your core is comfortable. Your face exposed to the air inside the curtain enclosure is cool, but not painfully so. This is it. This is the fortress. This is your defensive position against the night. Stone walls around the chamber, tapestries against the walls, bed curtains around the bed blankets over your body wool clothing against your skin. Layers upon layers upon layers, each contributing some small measure of protection. You've done everything you can. You've prepared insulated position, tucked, sealed. The rest is just endurance. Sleep when it comes will be a mercy unconsciousness, removing your awareness of the cold that continues to exist just beyond your fabric defenses. And when you wake at midnight for that expected interval, you'll assess, adjust and retreat back into this cocoon for the second sleep. But for now, you're settling. Your breathing is slowing. Your thoughts are drifting. The warmth is building millimetre by millimetre. The night is long. The cold is patient. But you're as ready as medieval engineering can make you. Now finally you let yourself sleep. Morning comes not with sudden awakening, but with gradual emergence, a slow climb from unconsciousness, back into the reality of your freezing stone chamber. You're not jolted awake by an alarm, those don't exist. Instead, you drift upward through layers of sleep, becoming aware first of sounds, then of cold, then of the fact that you've survived another night. The first sound is usually distant servants moving through the castle corridors, their footsteps echoing on stone floors, the scrape of a door opening somewhere below, voices muffled by distance and walls calling to each other as the household begins its daily routine. These sounds penetrate your curtained enclosure, faintly reaching you in your wool-wrapped cocoon like messages from another world. Your body knows it's morning before your mind fully accepts it. There's a quality to the darkness inside the bed curtains that feels different from midnight darkness, less absolute somehow, as if the fabric itself knows that dawn has arrived, even if no light penetrates through. Your internal rhythms synchronized to the sun cycle through months and years of pre-industrial living, recognize that the night has completed its arc. You don't move yet. Movement means exposure to cold air, and you're still warm or warm enough inside your fabric fortress. Your toes have maintained their temperature through the second sleep. Your fingers are tucked against your torso, still benefiting from core warmth. Your face is the coldest part of you, exposed to the air inside the curtain enclosure all night, but it's tolerable. If you share the bed, you become aware of your bed partner's presence through subtle cues. The rhythm of their breathing changes as they wake. A shift in position creates a rustle of fabric and a slight redistribution of shared blanket weight. Maybe a murmured word, a morning greeting spoken into darkness, before either of you has seen the other's face. The moment of decision arrives. Do you emerge or do you steal a few more minutes of warmth? The chamber beyond the curtains is brutally cold. You know this without checking. The fire banked last night has either died completely or reduced to barely warm ash. The stone walls have radiated cold all night with patient malevolence. The air temperature outside your bed is probably the coldest it will be all day, that pre-dawn nadir when the night's accumulated chill reaches its maximum. But remaining in bed indefinitely isn't practical. Your bladder probably needs attention after hours of sleep. The household is waking and obligations await. Servants will arrive soon to tend the fire, and you'd rather be up and semi-presentable than be found still bundled in bed like a child. Status and dignity require rising regardless of comfort. So you begin the extraction process. First, you move your arms from their tucked position against your body, extending them outward to push against the blanket weight. The air inside the curtain enclosure is cooler than the warm pocket directly against your body, and your arms register the temperature drop immediately. You push the top coverlet down, slightly reducing the compression on your chest. Then you reach for the curtain edge, feeling along the fabric until you find the overlap where two panels meet. You pull one aside, creating a gap, and cold air from the chamber rushes in like it's been waiting all night for exactly this opportunity. The temperature differential is shocking, perhaps 15 or 20 degrees difference between the inside of your bed enclosure and the chamber air. Your face, which had adapted to the curtain's microclimate, recoils from the invading cold. But there's also light, faint and grey, filtering through the shutter cracks, or perhaps from an opened door somewhere. After the complete darkness of the curtained bed, even dim pre-dawn light is significant. You can see the chamber now, or at least its shadows and shapes. The tapestries on the walls, the chest at the foot of the bed, the cold expanse of stone floor you'll have to cross. You sit up, which requires effort against the blanket weight. The fabric slides down your body as you rise, and you feel cold air penetrating through your wool shift, finding your back. Your shoulders, places that were warm a moment ago. Your breath condenses visibly in the chamber air, a confirmation, as if you needed it, that the temperature is well below comfort levels. Your bed partner, if present, is likely going through the same emergence process, and there's a coordination here. One person can't easily exit the bed without disturbing the blankets for the other, so you move together, sitting up simultaneously, both emerging from the cocoon into the hostile morning air. The floor is the next challenge. You swing your legs over the bed edge, and even through your wool hose you can feel how cold the step will be. You place your feet down, and yes, the wood is searingly cold, not quite frozen, but close enough that standing on it is actively painful. You stand anyway because remaining seated on the bed edge accomplishes nothing. Now you're vertical standing in your sleeping shift and nightcap wool hose on your feet, in a chamber that's probably somewhere around 35 or 40 degrees. The cold is comprehensive, attacking from every direction. The stone floor radiates cold upward into your feet. The chamber air surrounds you. The walls radiate cold inward. You're suddenly completely miserably cold, in a way you weren't 30 seconds ago when you were still in bed. This is when you move fast. Hesitation is the enemy. You cross to where your day clothes are stored, hung on pegs, folded in a chest wherever you keep them, and you begin dressing with urgent efficiency. Layer after layer, each piece of clothing adding insulation and slowly reducing your exposure to the ambient cold. A servant appears, having heard sounds of waking, or simply arriving at the appointed time for morning duties. They move to the fireplace, begin the process of rebuilding the fire from whatever embers remain, or if those have died, striking flint and steel to create new flame. This is skilled work, and you're grateful you don't have to do it yourself while shivering. Smoke begins to rise as kindling catches. Small flames appear, growing steadily as larger wood is added. The fire isn't providing meaningful heat yet, that will take time, but the sight of it is psychologically warming. The household is coming back to life. The night is officially over. You glance back at the bed, still rumpled, the curtains pulled aside, now the blankets disturbed, but still holding the ghost of your body's warmth. In a few hours, servants will remake it smooth. The sheets, rearrange the blankets, prepare it for tonight's battle. Because there's always tonight. Winter isn't one night, it's 100 nights, 200, however many it takes, until spring finally arrives and releases you from this daily siege. But you've made it through this one. You survived another medieval winter night in a castle bedroom. You didn't freeze. You didn't die of hypothermia. You didn't succumb to any of the dozen ways that cold can kill a sleeping person. The morning has arrived, and you're conscious to experience it. Around you, the castle is waking fully now. Somewhere below the kitchen, fires are being stoked for the day's cooking. In the great hall, servants are sweeping out yesterday's rushes. In the chapel, the priest is preparing for morning prayers. The entire household machinery is grinding back into motion, powered by the simple fact that people woke up instead of dying in their sleep. This wasn't guaranteed. Somewhere in this castle, in castles across Europe, in households wealthy and poor, someone didn't wake up this morning. A child whose breath just stopped. An elderly person whose heart gave out in the coldest hour before dawn. A sick person who couldn't fight both illness and cold simultaneously. The morning count isn't always the same as the evening count, but you're still here. Your breath still fogs the air. Your fingers are still numb despite your best efforts. Your toes ache as circulation gradually returns to them. You're not comfortable, not even close, but you're alive, dressed vertical, ready to face whatever the day demands. You move toward the window and push open one shutter just a crack. Cold air streams in, even colder than the chamber air, but there's light with it, real daylight, pale winter sun struggling through clouds. The world outside is grey and white frost covering everything, your breath adding to the moisture in the air. Somewhere out there, peasants are waking in their cottages, going through their own morning rituals. Some of them are warmer than you. Their smaller spaces, their central hearths, their practical timber construction actually retains heat better than your grand stone fortress. Some are colder, lacking even the basic resources you take for granted. But all of them, like you, are fighting the same enemy, the patient, relentless cold that wants nothing more than to stop their hearts and still their breath. And all of them, like you, have developed elaborate systems to resist. Different systems adapted to different circumstances, but fundamentally the same layers. Insulation shared, warmth, ritual prayer, and the stubborn human refusal to surrender to the elements. You close the shutter again. Enough light, enough cold air. The day is beginning properly now, and there's work to be done, obligations to fulfill, the endless machinery of medieval household management that doesn't pause for discomfort or cold. But first you'll go to the hall, find whatever warm food has been prepared for breaking the night's fast. Warm porridge, perhaps. Bread if there's any fresh. Ale to wash it down. You'll sit near the hall's larger fire and let warmth seep back into your bones gradually, carefully, the way it should be done. And tonight, as the sun sets early because it's winter, and the sun always sets early, you'll begin the whole process again. The preparation, the layering, the sealing yourself into the fabric fortress. The prayers whispered into darkness. The midnight wake with its quiet activities and eventual return to second sleep. The gradual emergence at dawn into cold that hasn't diminished, hasn't surrendered, hasn't given up its siege of your stone bedroom. This is your life. This is every noble's life in winter. Not the pageantry, not the feasts and tournaments and romantic notions. Just this, the daily nightly battle against cold. The accumulated wisdom of textile engineering and sleeping position, and meal timing and prayer rhythm, all devoted to the singular goal of waking up alive one more time. And you do wake up. Most mornings. Most winters. The system works not perfectly, but well enough. Well enough that you're still here, still breathing, still fighting. The cold is patient. The cold is relentless. The cold never stops trying. But neither do you. And in that stubborn refusal to surrender, in that daily recommitment to survival despite discomfort, despite fear, despite the knowledge that tonight will be just as hard as last night, in that persistence you find something that might not be comfort, but is perhaps something better. You find the knowledge that you can endure, that you have endured, that your ancestors endured and their ancestors before them, through winters colder than this one, through nights longer and darker and more desperate. You're part of that chain. That long human chain of people who refuse to let the cold win, and this morning, like every morning you wake up, you've added one more link to that chain. One more night survived, one more morning achieved, one more small victory against the infinite patience of winter. The fire is crackling properly now, starting to push back the cold in its immediate vicinity. You move closer, holding your hands toward the flames, feeling the radiant heat on your palms. You're cold, you're tired, you're facing another day, followed by another night, followed by another day, the cycle repeating, until spring finally arrives months from now. But you're here, you're breathing, you're alive, and for now, in this moment, that's enough. You've spent hours with me in that freezing stone chamber, and maybe now you understand something beautiful. Those medieval people weren't tougher than you. They were just stubborn. Stubborn enough to develop systems, wool layers, bed curtains, shared warmth, whispered prayers that kept them breathing through impossible cold. And they won. Not comfortably, but consistently enough that their knowledge reached you lying warm tonight in ways they couldn't imagine. Every modern comfort you have exists because someone centuries ago refused to let the cold win. They climbed into their fabric fortresses, tucked their freezing toes against their children, and trusted morning would come. It did. For enough of them, enough times that the chain reached you. So sleep now knowing you carry their victory. Your warmth tonight honours their cold nights. Your easy breath continues theirs. The medieval darkness is ending. Your modern night welcomes you, and the cold that patient ancient enemy stays outside where it belongs. Sleep well. The story ends here. See you in the next video. Good night.